At 7 in the morning, the day kicked off with a man finishing a hard 10-kilometer run, sweat still dripping as he slowed to a stop. From there until noon, he trained non-stop, practicing kendo and striking a wooden dummy 500 times straight to the head. By 5 in the evening, he was back at it in the gym, pushing his body under the watch of a coach, following a brutal plan of bench press, squats, and deadlifts, 10 reps per set, 10 sets each. To repeat this routine for 14 straight days, he had already handed in his resignation at the office, choosing to quit his job without hesitation. He remembered someone calling him insane for throwing away his career just to train his body, and as the thought lingered, he quietly admitted that maybe being crazy wouldn't have been so bad. Right then, a glowing system window suddenly appeared in front of him. It announced that the door of the end was about to open and that only 5 seconds remained before the end of days arrived. The system urged him to prepare, issuing quests meant to strengthen him for the coming catastrophe. As the seconds ticked away, the counter hit 0, and the end of days finally descended upon the world. 15 days earlier, every person received an alert on their phone warning of a severe disaster, stating that monsters had appeared near Inwang Mountain and that nearby residents had to evacuate immediately to avoid encountering them. The sudden message left people baffled, with many assuming it was nothing more than a bad joke or a false alarm. Moments later, a live news broadcast appeared on their screens, where a field reporter confirmed that the monsters were real and that the situation was no prank. Wanting better footage, the reporter told viewers he would move closer to get a clearer look at the creature. Instantly, the comments section exploded, with people desperately typing that the monster was standing right behind him. Laughing it off, the reporter said he didn't believe them, insisting he had checked just seconds ago and the monster hadn't moved at all. In the next instant, the creature appeared directly behind him and killed him on the spot. The sudden scream echoed through the broadcast, shocking a man watching the scene, Lee Hoyoung. As Lee Hoyoung continued down the street, he felt uneasy because the video he had just watched looked disturbingly real, and disaster alerts kept buzzing on everyone's phones all day, making him wonder what was truly going on. He thought bitterly that life was already hard enough just trying to earn a living, so the idea of monsters suddenly appearing was something he refused to accept. Convincing himself it had to be another fake clip like so many others online, Lee was about to dismiss it all, until he lifted his head and froze at the sight of a wounded monster lying right in front of him. Confusion rushed through his mind as he wondered why a creature like that was hurt and collapsed on the ground. Fear took over almost instantly, and his first instinct was to turn around and run as fast as he could. Trying to ignore what he saw, Lee loudly muttered an excuse to himself, claiming he had to hurry home because his math teacher was coming today. At that moment, the injured monster weakly reached out to stop him and looked up with an oddly innocent expression, asking Lee to help. Lee hesitated, unsure if the creature was truly begging for assistance. But no matter how pitiful it acted or how cute it tried to seem, its terrifying appearance made his skin crawl and kept him from getting any closer. Lee told himself that he was human and the being in front of him was a monster, and he wasn't kind enough to feel sympathy for something like that, insisting that no matter how pure those eyes looked, he couldn't bring himself to help it. But then the creature slowly pulled out a small picture, showing what looked like its family, crying as it pointed again and again, clearly begging to return to them. Seeing that broke something inside Lee, and before he could stop himself, he gave in and chose to help the monster after all. Not long after, Lee was back at his house when a system window suddenly appeared, informing him that he had obtained a silver goblin pill, and that consuming it would grant him an unknown, hidden benefit. Lee stared in disbelief, thinking it was strange enough that he had helped the monster, but now he had even received a reward from it, which didn't match what monsters were supposed to be like. Curious about the gift and confused by the system that kept popping up, Lee reached out and touched the screen, wondering if it was some kind of advanced hologram. His thoughts then shifted to the pill itself, questioning what would happen if he actually swallowed something given by a monster. At that exact moment, a breaking news alert flashed across the television, where a reporter announced that massive, unknown structures had suddenly appeared across the world, shaped like towering spires, and that all contact had been lost with a U.S. military unit sent inside one of them. Hearing the broadcast, Lee froze in disbelief as monsters and mysterious towers became reality, making him wonder if the end of the world had truly begun. Just then, as he held the pill in his palm, a violent blast shook the area outside his house. People screamed and scattered in panic, and moments later, everyone stopped in shock when a massive tower rose from the ground without warning. The reporter urgently announced that another enormous tower had appeared in Korea. Staring at the structure, standing dangerously close to his home, Lee tightened his grip and made up his mind to use the pill the monster had given him. He wasn't sure if this choice was right, But he knew this was the only moment he would ever dare to do something so reckless as swallowing a monster's gift. Without hesitating further, he consumed it, and instantly a powerful force burst out from his body. The system reappeared, informing him that he had acquired the Sage status window, a blessing meant to greatly increase his chances of survival. Shimmering fragments like puzzle pieces gathered in midair, slowly shaping themselves into a radiant book. Lee reached out in disbelief, staring at the glowing book now resting firmly in his hands. The moment Lee opened the book, a blinding glow poured out, flooding the room, and the system appeared again with a warning. The gate to the end of days would open in exactly 15 days, for hours and 12 minutes. It told Lee to get ready for what was coming and strongly advised him to train his body, immediately assigning a series of tasks that included strength workouts, endurance training, and practicing kendo for the time he had left. Faced with this message, Lee chose to obey without hesitation. Days slipped by as he followed every instruction, cutting off everything else in his life and dedicating all 15 days solely to training. When the countdown finally reached its end, the door of the apocalypse opened. The system alert that followed caught Lee off guard, as it looked nothing like what he had imagined. A dull sword suddenly appeared in front of him, leaving him staring in disbelief at the weapon that had just been summoned. The system then announced that the game had officially begun and that the tutorial phase was over. Finally, it informed him that his aptitude test was complete and that, based on the collected data, he would now receive the class best suited for him. The system announced that Lee had been assigned the class of combat swordsmanship, and the moment he saw it, he was taken aback, never expecting something like that. It then instructed him to check his status screen for full information, but when Lee opened it, his head spun as countless panels and lines of text appeared all at once. After calming down, he focused and noticed that he was a level 1 swordsman with a level 1 basic sword skill. His attributes, endurance, power, speed, and perception, were all extremely low, which made sense since he had only just begun. Rising to his feet, Lee gripped the sword in his hand, excitement bubbling up as the reality of being a combat swordsman finally sank in. He felt that this was the true starting point of everything. At that moment, the system displayed 2 mission choices he had to clear at least one of. The first task was to stay alive inside the forest for a full hour, while the second was to locate an exit and escape the area. Lee frowned, wondering that if this really counted as a tutorial, shouldn't it give him some breathing room before throwing him straight into danger? Lee checked the guidebook stored inside the system, and it clearly advised him to use the entire 60 minutes of the tutorial to hunt as many creatures as possible. It even warned that picking the escape option would slow his growth and was strongly discouraged. This surprised Lee, especially when he realized he could still access the Sage's status window during the tutorial phase. At that moment, he understood why the system had pushed him to train his body beforehand. It had predicted this exact scenario. Following the guide's advice, Lee decided that running away from the forest would be a waste. Just then, the system announced that the tutorial had officially begun, and almost immediately, a small creature appeared before him. Lee blinked in confusion when he saw it was only a level 1, one-horned raccoon, far cuter than he imagined a monster would be. That illusion shattered instantly as the creature twisted its face into a feral snarl and leapt straight at him. Acting on instinct, Lee swung his sword and cut it down cleanly, realizing with surprise that defeating it was far easier than he expected. The system immediately declared that the one-horned raccoon had been defeated, and Lee was rewarded with experience for the kill. Since the creature fell from single use of basic sword technique, Lee figured it was weak by design, nothing more than a beginner enemy. He then noticed that activating the skill had drained 2 points of mana, and with only 10 mana in total, he realized he could swing it just 5 more times. That realization made him cautious, and he decided he would need to save his mana carefully while continuing the hunt. After cutting down monster after monster, a sudden change occurred as his level finally increased, pushing him to level 2, and along with it, his health and mana fully recovered. The system informed him that leveling up would now grant stat points, which could be used to strengthen his attributes, and this news filled Lee with excitement. He felt relieved he had leveled up just in time, since his mana had been nearly empty. However, his relief turned to confusion when the system screen began fading away, only for it to explain that because he possessed the Sage's status window, his leveling speed would be slower than that of normal players. Lee was stunned when he learned the truth and finally understood that the Sage's status came with a price. What shocked him even more was realizing that the level he had just earned was gone, making him wonder how long it would take to climb again. The frustration hit hard, and he cursed the unfair drawback that came with such a rare ability. Curious and irritated, he opened his status screen, only to freeze when the numbers didn't look right at all. As he studied them more closely, he noticed something strange. His points were still there, That's when a new thought struck him. Maybe this wasn't a punishment, but a broken advantage instead. His level had dropped back to 1, just as expected, yet the leftover points kept increasing. He quickly realized that since each level demanded more experience than the last, boosting his stats this way might be far more efficient than leveling normally. With that realization, Lee decided that from now on, he would focus on strengthening his attributes. And, as he scanned the screen, he saw 4 different options waiting for him to choose from. Lee weighed his options and figured that power and speed were the natural picks for a sword fighter, since more strength meant heavier hits and more agility meant quicker movement and sharper reactions. But after a moment of thought, he decided that what he needed most right now was awareness. So he invested his points in his sensitivity instead. As he continued cutting down one-horned raccoons, he realized the creatures nearby were weak since this was still the tutorial zone, and beating them with his base stats wasn't hard at all. The real issue was that there weren't many raccoons around, and the limited time made it hard to farm enough to boost his attributes. That was exactly why he chose sensitivity, and once it increased, tracking down the monsters became far easier than before. Just as he was thinking through his plan, a system message suddenly appeared, announcing that all nearby monsters had been cleared and that a hidden quest had been triggered. At that instant, a massive level 2 creature stepped out behind him, a one-horned raccoon alpha, staring at Lee with raw hostility. Feeling the pressure, Lee swallowed and wondered what kind of monster had just appeared before him. The monster suddenly lunged at Lee with a strong attack, but Lee barely managed to dodge it in time. He thought to himself how fast the creature was and wondered if this was the tutorial boss. Trying to stay calm, Lee decided to carefully watch and study the fight. As he looked closer, he noticed this monster was unlike the other one-horned raccoons he had fought before. Even though it was stronger, Lee believed it was still possible to beat it. After a tense battle, the system popped up, announcing that Lee had defeated the one-horned raccoon alpha and completed the hidden quest, rewarding him with some gold. Then the system declared the tutorial was finished. Lee realized that the hour had felt longer than he expected, but was relieved it was finally over. However, when he opened his eyes, he was shocked to find himself in a completely new place, standing among a crowd of other people. Just then, a loud announcement congratulated everyone for finishing the tutorial. It explained that they were now in the tower's lobby, specifically in the C-2567 area. Lee was puzzled by the word lobby and wondered what it meant. Looking around, he saw 14 men and 11 women and guessed they had all completed the same tutorial and were brought here like him. Most people seemed scared, which made sense since the world had changed so much in just one day. Lee thought that if he hadn't known the world was ending, he'd probably be scared too. He told himself to stay calm and promised to survive this challenge. Suddenly, a woman asked where exactly they were. At that moment, a small figure appeared and told her they were inside the tower called the Tower of the End. When the woman looked down, she couldn't believe her eyes. A rabbit was talking back to her. The rabbit introduced itself as Kumkum, the manager of the tower's lower floor. Everyone stared in disbelief, bombarding Kumkum with questions. How did it suddenly appear? Was it just a kid in a rabbit costume? Or maybe it was the one who had gathered all of them in this strange tower. Kumkum sighed quietly, knowing this was the usual reaction from people. Then Lee stepped forward, asking Kumkum one important thing. If this really was the end of the world, what were they supposed to do now? Kumkum smiled slyly and told Lee that was a very smart question. With a mischievous grin, Kumkum announced to everyone that all 22 players waiting in the tower's lobby would be forced into a deadly game, where their lives were on the line. Shock rippled through the crowd at the thought of risking their lives. Kumkum went on to explain that every human on Earth was trapped inside the tower, and the only way to survive was by teaming up to complete missions and climb each floor. Lee then asked if they could return to their old lives once they reached the top. Kumkum chuckled and admitted it had no idea what awaited them at the summit. Hearing this, Lee asked Kumkum what the real purpose was behind climbing the tower. Kumkum shrugged off the question, saying there was no need to dig for meaning. Lee just had to follow the rules and do what he was told. It added that anyone who refused to climb would only meet death, and many had already perished during the tutorial rounds. Lee suddenly felt a wave of panic. He hadn't expected people to actually die, especially so early, and he knew plenty wouldn't even finish the tutorial alive. Then, out of nowhere, Kumkum challenged everyone, asking if anyone dared to try killing it, explaining that it needed to be defeated for them to get home. On top of that, anyone who helped kill Kumkum would earn a special reward. The crowd was stunned and confused, but Lee immediately suspected a trap. Kumkum didn't look powerful, but being level 55 meant Lee had no chance in a fight. Deciding it was safer to hold back and watch for now, Lee hesitated. But just then, a system message appeared, ordering Lee to assist the lower floor manager, Kumkum, in getting home. Lee mulled over the whole situation, wondering how exactly he was supposed to help Kumkum get home, and if it was even safe to try attacking the rabbit. He thought about how following the guide had always worked out so far, but now he wasn't sure if taking a risk like this was worth it. Confused and uncertain, Lee stood frozen, unsure what to do next. Just then, a man stepped forward, volunteering to help Kumkum get home. With a sly smile, the man told Kumkum that if it wanted to die so badly, he was more than willing to make that happen. Lee thought to himself that he was too slow to offer first, as the man raised his sword, warning Kumkum not to regret what was coming and promising a painful death. But before the man could strike, Kumkum's face twisted into something fierce, and in a blink, the rabbit landed a brutal hit that sliced the man's head clean off, sending it flying through the air. The crowd gasped, frozen with fear, unable to react. Kumkum then grinned wickedly and said it had just accidentally counterattacked, but everyone screamed in terror, too stunned by the brutal display to believe otherwise. Lee stood silent, heart pounding, thinking how close he had been to facing that same fate if he had stepped up first. Kumkum quickly apologized, saying it was just a mistake and asked if anyone else would volunteer, but nobody believed it. Fearful, everyone started backing away, desperate to get as far from Kumkum as possible. Lee wondered if the guide had tricked him. Kumkum then stretched out its paw again, pleading for help to get home, but after witnessing the brutal attack, no one dared come forward. Frustrated, Lee questioned why the guide might have lied, so he opened the guidebook again. That's when he discovered a hidden skill called Sage's Eyes, separate from the usual Sage's status window. Using Sage's Eyes would trigger a special window, allowing him to see other people's status. Curious why this new skill appeared out of nowhere, Lee activated Sage's Eyes on Kumkum. A smile spread across his face as the answer to helping Kumkum became clear. While Kumkum kept begging for aid, Lee stepped up and volunteered to help. As he offered, Lee reassured himself that the guide hadn't lied after all. Kumkum looked Lee over and pointed out he was just level 1, but Lee cut in confidently, saying that level didn't matter when doing something good. Kumkum smirked wickedly and agreed, saying Lee was right. Kumkum told Lee to hurry up and send it home. But just as Lee reached for his sword, a woman stopped him, warning it was too risky since they had just seen someone die trying to do the same. Soon, others joined in, agreeing Lee shouldn't be reckless. But Lee cut them off calmly, saying he had a plan and promised everyone they were about to witness something amazing. Everyone looked at him, puzzled, wondering what kind of plan he could have. Suddenly, Kumkum lunged at Lee, but Lee stayed calm, not afraid at all. Then, Lee realized something was off. Kumkum said there were 24 players in the lobby, but Lee was sure there were 25. At first, he thought it was a slip-up, but then he figured it was on purpose, a test to scare them with the idea of facing a powerful level 55 monster. The number was wrong because one of the people was actually a hologram, the one who died earlier. Everyone gasped as Kumkum struck Lee with a strong blow, but Lee wasn't worried because not only was the dead man a hologram, Kumkum was 1-2, meaning its attack did 0 damage. Lee had discovered all this by using his Sage's Eyes to check Kumkum's stats and saw it was just a projection. Realizing Lee had seen through the trick, Kumkum praised him, saying he was pretty sharp. It added that for brave people like Lee, luck might just be on their side, then vanished into thin air. When Kumkum disappeared, it left behind a glowing green pill as a reward for Lee. Everyone then understood that Kumkum was just a hologram, nothing more than a fake. One person asked Lee how he had figured it out so quickly. Lee explained that he noticed something strange. Blood should have splattered on Chai Yiziel, the woman who had warned him, since she was standing so close to the dead person. But she wasn't covered in a single drop. That's when Lee realized the whole scene was staged. Chai touched her face and confirmed Lee was right. There wasn't any blood on her at all. Just then, a tall man named Kim Seong, who was level 4, stepped forward. Seong told Lee it would be a shame to keep the reward all to himself, and said Lee was just lucky to figure out first. He added that if he had noticed sooner, he would have done the same thing. Curious, Lee asked why Seong thought it would be a waste. Seong explained that since Lee was still level 1 after finishing the tutorial, it meant he was either really weak or hadn't fought at all, probably just ran away to survive. Seong sneered and told Lee he'd probably die fast anyway, so for the sake of everyone else, he should just hand over that reward right now. Lee thought to himself that Seong was ridiculously full of himself and couldn't believe he was actually serious. Without hesitation, Lee used the green pill right in front of Seong and gained a stat point. Seong's jaw dropped, stunned that Lee had defied his expectations. Lee smirked and told Seong that giving up wasn't his style and he wasn't about to surrender to anyone. Seong got mad and shot back that Lee was just a weak loser, acting tough to hide the fact that he was still level 1. Lee thought it would be smart to stay away from people like Seong, but he wondered how long he could keep dodging trouble. Just then, An announcement echoed through the room, saying everyone would now get their starting gold, which they could spend in the shop. On top of that, extra gold would be awarded based on how many monsters they'd killed in the tutorial. The announcement added that the highest gold earned by a player during the tutorial was 7,400. Everyone's eyes widened at the thought of someone getting that much gold. Seong looked annoyed, realizing he should have done better killing monsters back then. Another guy named Kim Junsong piped up, saying he didn't know who came first, but whoever it was had to be incredible. No one knew who had earned the most gold, except Lee, who quietly held the top spot with 7,400 gold from killing the most monsters in the tutorial. Lee decided to keep this a secret since Seong was already jealous over just a single stat point, and he didn't want to invite more trouble. Opening the shop, Lee noticed there were 3 ways to spend gold: buy items, level up skills, or increase stats. Lee chose to spend half his gold on boosting his stats, raising his strength, stamina, agility, and sensitivity all by 20 points. While he focused on upgrading, Seong grew visibly angry because leveling skills cost a lot. Spotting Seong's frustration, Lee decided to spend 1,500 gold improving his basic sword skill. He also picked up some new clothes since he was tired of wearing the same gym uniform. Just then, Chai Yizil approached Lee, saying she wanted to ask for his advice. Surprised, Lee asked why she had come to him when he was just level 1. Yizil smiled and said she didn't care about his level. She admired his courage instead. Lee was taken aback by her words. Curious, he used his skills to check her stats, then asked how much gold she had. Yizil replied she had 800 gold saved up. Lee noticed that Yizil was being honest about her gold. She didn't try to hide anything. He quickly decided to keep his secret cheat key to himself. To keep things casual, Lee asked if Yizil liked exercising, and she replied that she didn't mind walking. Lee guessed her stamina probably wasn't very strong, and Yizil nodded in agreement. He told her that if her stamina was low, she should focus on improving it first, because no matter how much gold she spent on items, she wouldn't last long without enough stamina. Feeling encouraged, Yizil thanked Lee and promised to follow his advice. Suddenly, an announcement came through saying the first floor mission would start soon, and they needed to form teams of 3. If anyone didn't have a team, they'd be assigned to a random group. Players were given 3 minutes to choose their parties. Lee thought to himself he expected a group mission eventually, but not this soon. Then Junsong spoke up, suggesting since everyone could see each other's levels, they should also share their classes. Following his idea, players began revealing their classes and started picking teammates they wanted to join for the mission. Yizil approached Lee and asked if he wanted to team up for the upcoming group mission, becoming the first member of his party. Lee didn't hesitate to agree. Having a healer like Yizil on his team was a big advantage, but things weren't as easy with the others. Every single one of them turned down Lee's offer to join his group. Lee figured that even though they had a healer, people probably didn't want to team up with someone as low level as him. It made sense. A level 1 swordsman wasn't exactly a tempting partner. Watching the others, Lee saw that most players had already formed teams with people around their own level. The only ones left without a team were the people Lee least wanted to be with. After a few minutes, an announcement said the 3-minute team building window was over, and anyone without a full party would be assigned randomly. It also announced that the first floor mission was about to start. Seong, now stuck in the same group as Lee and Yizil, grumbled that he was unlucky to be teamed with a low-level bottom feeder like Lee. Lee thought to himself that he didn't want to be teamed with Seong either, but surprisingly, Seong was even less popular despite being level 4. Seong glared at Lee with annoyance and snapped, "What are you staring at? Just move away." Lee wondered if working with Seong was even possible, but he quickly made up his mind. No matter what, he'd find a way to cooperate with Seong if he wanted to survive in this tower. Right then, the system popped up with their mission: eliminate the Kobold tribe within 12 hours. As the trio walked through the forest, they finally reached the Kobold camp. Seong turned to Lee and said he would take care of wiping out the tribe, warning Lee not to get in his way. Lee reminded Seong that this was a team mission, not a solo job. That made Seong furious. He called Lee a loser and said he was only letting Lee tag along out of kindness. So, Lee had no right to boss him around. Lee sighed and replied, "Fine, he'll just ride on your coattails and see how well you do." Lee decided to just go along with Seong for now. Seong told him, "You've been riding my coattails from the start, so why act all rebellious now?" He added that Lee should only start trying hard when his life was actually in danger. Lee gave a sarcastic, "Thank for the advice." Yizil looked worried, wondering if their team was going to hold together. As they neared the Kobold camp, Seong grumbled about all the bugs around, while he grew annoyed at Seong's complaining and hoped they could finish the mission without problems. Looking up, Lee noticed there really were a lot of bugs, which made sense since they were in the mountains. Yizil then asked Lee if the kobolds were strong. Lee said they might be tougher than the one-horned raccoon they'd faced before, but since they were still level 1, they should be able to handle them. He also warned Yiziel to stay alert because, in the Tower of the End, anything could happen. Yiziel nodded in agreement. As they got closer, Lee noticed the kobold was level 5 and incredibly muscular from head to toe. He was surprised because this monster was way tougher than the ones they had faced in the tutorial. Yiziel also spotted the kobold and told Lee he was clearly stronger than before, then asked what their plan was. Lee suggested they should first check the area carefully since there might be more kobolds hiding nearby. But before Lee could finish, Seong suddenly stepped into the open and snapped at Lee, saying it was because Lee kept hiding instead of fighting that he was still stuck at level 1. Without waiting, Seong charged straight at the kobold and struck it hard on the head. Lee and Yiziel were shocked Seong would just rush in like that without a plan. Seong's hit didn't do much damage, and the angry kobold glared back. Still, Seong didn't back down and started landing a flurry of heavy attacks. Lee thought to himself how reckless and stubborn Seong was to jump in like that alone. Just then, Yiziel stepped forward, telling Lee she would support Seong by healing him. Lee felt relieved they weren't surrounded by more kobolds, or else things could have gotten much worse. As Lee watched Seong fight the kobold, he could see Seong was definitely showing off his level. With Yiziel healing him, Seong might even beat the kobold on his own. But Lee was surprised that Seong's attacks didn't do as much damage as he expected given his strength, and he wondered if the kobold had some special defense. Lee quickly checked his guidebook for help. The book said kobolds were usually peaceful and wouldn't attack unless provoked. Lee thought to himself that Seong had just stirred up trouble for no good reason. Still, he tried to see the bright side. He needed to catch some kobolds anyway for research, so the fight wasn't all bad. Then, as Lee kept reading the guidebook, he spotted something that might give them an advantage in the battle. Seong tried to use his level 1 skill, Stone Fist, and swung a punch at the kobold, but he missed and hit a tree instead. The tree broke and crashed down, landing right on the head of another kobold nearby, who was level 6 and even stronger than the one Seong had been fighting. Seong immediately regretted his mistake. As the bigger kobold charged at him, Seong worried he was in serious trouble. He looked around for Lee, wondering why he wasn't helping, but when he turned, Lee was nowhere to be seen. Seong guessed he had probably run off scared. Just then, the kobold swung at Seong, but Yiziel jumped in to block the attack and protect him. While warning Seong to be careful, Yiziel slipped and fell to the ground. The kobold was about to strike her with a powerful blow, and Yiziel thought this might be the end for her. Suddenly, Lee appeared from behind, threw a strange fruit into the air, and sliced it open. The fruit's juice spilled onto his sword as he swung, cutting the kobold and dealing massive damage, killing it instantly. The system then popped up, congratulating Lee for defeating the level 6 kobold. Seong and Yiziel were both stunned to see Lee take down the kobold with just one clean slash. Lee smiled to himself, realizing that while the bugs ate the fruit from the trees, the kobolds hadn't touched a single one. That seemed strange. Checking his guidebook, Lee found out the fruit was called a poison apple, and kobolds were weak against poison. The book even suggested collecting these fruits from the mountain to use them in battle against the kobolds. Lee understood that using the poison apples was the secret to finishing the level 1 mission. Seong was annoyed by how things turned out, but Lee walked over to Yiziel and helped her up, asking if she was alright. She thanked him and said she was fine. Lee admitted he hadn't expected another kobold to be drawn in by the fight, and said it would have been dangerous if had been late. Yiziel appreciated that he arrived just in time to save both her and Seong. When Yiziel asked where Lee had gone, he was about to answer, but Seong cut in angrily, calling Lee a free rider who hid safely while Seong did the hard work and only showed up to steal the final hit. Lee was puzzled by Seong's complaints, while Seong kept accusing Lee of being unfair for stealing the stat points that should have been his after fighting the kobolds. Without waiting for a reply, Seong stormed off, saying he was the bigger person since he was a higher level and would let it slide. Lee thought Seong was acting crazy. If Lee hadn't helped, Seong would have been in serious trouble or worse. Watching Seong's behavior, Lee figured Seong didn't understand the situation and would only make things harder for himself if he kept acting like this. Later in the kobold village, Seong was fighting hard, but his attacks barely hurt the kobolds. Even though the kobolds were hitting him hard, Seong kept telling himself they wouldn't take him down. But when he saw Lee and Yiziel happily taking down monsters with ease, Seong wondered how they managed it so well while he kept getting beaten badly. Eventually, after getting knocked down multiple times, Seong was hurt badly and ended up on the ground, crying and begging for help because he couldn't take it anymore. Just as Seong was crying, he suddenly noticed the attacks had stopped. Looking up, he saw the kobolds that had been beating him were all lying dead. Lee and Yiziel had taken them out. Lee walked over, offered his hand, and joked that had taken over the coattail ride from Seong for a while. He asked how Seong liked the ride with Lee in charge now. Seong smiled broadly, called Lee Big Brother, and shouted happily, gratefully it saved him. Lee and Yizil were both surprised by how quickly Seong's attitude had changed. Right then, the system popped up, announcing they completed the mission. A few moments later, the three returned to the lobby. Seong, remembering what Head done, regretted bowing to Lee and told him Head serve him from now on. He was annoyed that Head called a newbie like Lee sir. Seong was now level 8, while Lee was only level 2, yet it was Lee who had saved him. Seong worried what would happen if others found out, but, feeling proud, he refused to take back his words and grew irritated again. Lee noticed Seong making some strange faces and thought maybe he needed to use the restroom or something. Yizil looked around and saw the lobby was empty, so she guessed they might be the first ones to finish the mission. Lee agreed and said it seemed like they finished before anyone else because they had cleverly discovered the kobold's weakness and took them down quickly. Seong was shocked to hear they were actually the first to complete the mission. Yizil told Lee it wasn't just luck, it was a sharp observation that helped them win first. She said she never would have thought to use the poison from the fruit against the kobolds. Lee gave credit to Yizil's support, saying it would have been much harder to fight the monsters without her help. Just then, other groups of players started coming through the gate after finishing their missions. Lee told the others it looked like more teams were returning and wondered if they were Junsong's and Juno's groups. He also thought maybe those teams had found the poison apples too and hoped all the other parties would get back to the lobby safely. Just then, a player announced that another team had returned alive and finished their mission. Watching them, Yizil noticed only 2 players came through the gate and asked what happened to the third. One of the players started crying and admitted that only the 2 of them had made out alive. Right after, an announcement declared that all teams had completed the first level mission. Yizil quickly pointed out that some players were still missing, and the announcement confirmed that 6 teams had made it back safely, but 8 players hadn't returned at all. Lee was shocked to hear this. He thought it would be tough to survive, but he didn't expect 8 people to die on the very first level. He wondered how many more would perish before reaching the top. Then the announcement said it was calculating rewards for the first mission and that teams who returned in one piece, plus those who finished first, would get 100 gold each. Lee checked and saw he earned 2,000 gold for both bonuses. Though it wasn't a huge amount compared to the tutorial, gold was like insurance for his survival, so Lee was happy to get it. Lee thought to himself that he needed to save as much gold as possible. While he was lost in thought, someone asked which team had finished the mission first. Lee figured he had to admit it now, since the second team already knew his group was first. Just as he was about to speak, Seong stepped forward and boldly claimed their team was the first to complete level 1. He bragged that it was no surprise they won and told everyone not to feel bad about losing. Everyone was shocked to hear Seong's team took first place. Seong noticed their surprise and asked why they doubted him, saying they were just upset they didn't win. The crowd explained it wasn't because of that, but because Lee was on Seong's team, and even though they finished first, Lee was only level 2. They glared at Lee and accused him of getting 2,000 gold for free without doing much, warning him not to get too full of himself. As the group started criticizing Lee, he began to feel annoyed by their harsh words. Just as Yizil was about to speak up and give Lee credit for their first place finish, Lee quickly stopped her, saying it was pointless because no one would listen anyway. He told her head prove it with actions, not just words. Then Junsong stepped forward, urging everyone to calm down and focus on surviving instead of arguing. Junsong, a level 8 archer and one of the strongest players in the area, wasn't alone. CEO Juno, also level 8 and a combat swordsman, agreed with him. Juno added that they needed to keep going for the sake of those who had already fallen. Inspired by their words, the group cheered and encouraged each other, ready to face whatever came next. Suddenly, the blue flames lighting the lobby vanished, replaced by eerie red flames. At that moment, an announcement blared through, warning everyone inside. Confusion spread as nobody knew what was happening. Suddenly, a voice announced that the survival rate for the first level in Region C, 2567, was below average, so a penalty mission was being introduced. Everyone was stunned and confused. How could there be a penalty mission? The announcement continued, saying a death mission would start soon. Each player had to silently pick one person in their mind to take on the deadly task. The player with the most votes would have to face the mission, and they only had 5 minutes to decide. Shock rippled through the group. The announcement warned that if no one was chosen, the players would automatically vote for themselves to take on the death mission. At that moment, everyone realized that being picked meant almost certain death. As everyone panicked, trying to decide who would take on the death mission, Yizil spoke up, saying that if everyone voted for themselves, maybe no one would have to do it. But someone quickly pointed out that if no one was chosen, they might all end up having to face the mission anyway. Another player warned them to stop arguing because time was running out. Suddenly, a player pointed at Lee and voted for him to take the death mission. Yizil was shocked, but Lee stayed quiet. Juno stepped forward and apologized to Lee, saying they had no choice but to pick someone. Lee admitted he expected it, but still felt nervous about dying. Juno felt sorry but knew he couldn't help. Yziel urged everyone again to vote for themselves, hoping to avoid the mission, but Lee interrupted her, saying it probably wouldn't work since trust was already broken. He believed their best chance was to pick one person. As the seconds passed, more and more votes piled up above Lee's head. Lee realized the main reason was obvious. He was the lowest level, making him an easy target. Everyone seemed to have forgotten the idea that the strong should protect the weak. As Lee thought about this, Yziel stepped forward, her face full of anger, and told the group they were being too heartless. She couldn't believe they'd treat Lee this way. One player asked Yziel what they were supposed to do if they didn't pick Lee since none of them wanted to die, so voting was necessary. Another player added that it didn't even matter who they chose because Lee was going to die anyway since he was so weak. At that moment, Lee realized everyone's true nature was showing. Their masks had fallen off. Then Seong walked over, smirking as he voted for Lee to take on the death mission. Lee understood then how cruel and real this world called the Tower of the End really was. The timer ran out, and an announcement declared that all votes were in, and the portal to the death mission was opening. Lee stood before the glowing gate, ready to step inside. Seong spoke up, saying that now that Lee was going to die, Seong's problems were solved, and he was glad he had voted for Lee, calling himself a genius for it. Lee thought to himself that he was the chosen sacrifice, the lamb on the altar, surrounded by faces showing a mix of guilt and relief. Still, he had no choice but to face the death mission. But secretly, Lee knew this wasn't the end for him. The guidebook said he had a good chance of clearing the mission, and there was a great reward waiting. He smiled as he walked through the gate, knowing this challenge could actually help him. Back in the lobby, Yziel sat near Seong, looking worried and sad about Lee. Junsong came over and asked if she was okay, reminding her that even though it was brief, they were still a team who looked out for each other, so it felt painful to be separated from Lee like this. Seong cut off Junsong, saying there was no reason to feel sorry. Lee was just getting what he deserved. Junsong asked Seong to explain what he meant. Seong replied that Lee was a low-level player who only rode on Seong's strength while they were in the same team, basically freeloading off him. Yziel overheard and challenged Seong, saying it was thanks to Lee's skills that they finished the first mission so easily. Seong snapped back at Yziel, yelling that Lee had no real skills and just got lucky, only landing the final hit after Seong had weakened the monster. Yziel was shocked that Seong would lie, knowing perfectly well what really happened. She asked Seong if he truly believed that, because she clearly remembered Lee saving Seong when he almost died. Seong had no answer for that. Thinking quietly to himself, Seong realized Lee had actually killed most of the monsters and started wondering if Lee had some secret ability to fake his level. Suddenly, Seong grew worried. Maybe Lee wasn't really going to fail the death mission after all, and that made him nervous about Lee surviving. Junsong looked at Yziel and Seong and said he hoped Lee was really as strong as Yziel believed, because if Lee was, there was a chance he might survive the death mission. Yziel, with tears in her eyes, remembered Lee's words promising to prove everyone wrong and show them he deserved respect. Wiping her tears away, she told Junsong she trusted Lee and believed he would come back safely. Junsong smiled and said he felt the same. Meanwhile, inside the gate, Lee glanced around and noticed the bodies scattered everywhere were the kobolds he had fought before, which gave him an eerie feeling. Trying to shake it off, he opened his guidebook and thought that if things turned bad, he would have voted for himself to face the death mission. He felt relieved that things seemed to be going his way, even though he was annoyed at Seong for pretending to be friendly during the mission, but then quickly betraying him as soon as he got the chance. The system suddenly announced that the kobold hunting group had returned, and the death mission was about to begin. Lee's task was clear: defeat the angry chieftain and its hunting party, furious over the loss of their tribesmen. Right then, the level 12 chieftain let out a terrifying roar, charging at Lee with all the other kobolds ready to take him down. But Lee wasn't worried. He already knew their secret weakness. Just like the others, the chieftain was vulnerable to poison, and Lee planned to use that to his advantage. Standing before the furious kobolds and their powerful leader, Lee thought it would be impossible for most players to survive this mission. Most would have given up, accepting their fate. But this wasn't any player. It was Lee, and he was ready for the fight. Coating his sword with the poisonous juice from the apples, Lee sliced through the charging kobolds one by one without much trouble. As he wiped his blade clean, Lee realized the real challenge was still ahead. The kobold chieftain was the only one left standing between him and victory. Lee charged straight at the chieftain boss, eager to see how tough this final enemy really was. He swung his sword, but the chieftain skillfully blocked the strike, pulling back just enough to reduce the blow. Lee was shocked. He hadn't expected a monster to have such a smart defense. Just as Li was impressed by the chieftain's strength, it suddenly turned and ran, leaving Li stunned that the boss was actually fleeing from him. As Li chased the panicked chieftain, he couldn't help but feel disappointed. A boss running away like this seemed weak, and Li thought the mission might end quicker than expected. Swinging his sword again, Li believed the death mission was more like an easy bonus round that anyone could finish. But just when Li tried to land the final hit, his sword suddenly couldn't cut through the chieftain's body anymore, catching him completely off guard. The chieftain then stared up at the full moon, and something inside it seemed to awaken. Without warning, it struck back hard, slashing Li across the right shoulder with a powerful attack. In the lobby, Sejong stood with a big ego and told everyone that since Li was already dead, there was nothing to worry about. He claimed he would carry the whole group through the floors alone. Yeziel ignored Sejong's boasting and quietly prayed for Li's safe return. Annoyed, Sejong snapped at her, saying it was pointless to pray for someone who was gone. Furious, Yeziel scolded Sejong, telling him he should at least have some heart, even if the world was falling apart. Sejong was caught off guard by her words. Yeziel then asked him what he would do if Li actually came back alive, but Sejong quickly cut her off, insisting Li had no chance of surviving the death mission. As the two argued, Yeziel suddenly spotted movement by the portal. Everyone turned to see a figure stepping through, and it was Li. Junsong looked stunned, while Juno grinned with relief to see Li alive. Just then, an announcement declared that Li had survived the death mission and returned safely. Smiling, Li told everyone proudly that he had made it back alive and well. Just moments before, Li was badly hurt, a deep slash across his chest from the chieftain, leaving him close to death with barely any health left. He knew he had to stop the bleeding quickly and land one final strike to kill the chieftain, but he wasn't sure how. When the chieftain swung a strong attack at him, Li barely managed to dodge, struggling to stay on his feet. Then, an idea hit him. He realized that while a sword might not cut through a solid wall, even a small nail can pierce it. Li understood he had been thinking about his sword only for slashing, but it could be used differently. Deciding to try a new move, Li planned to use the chieftain's own force against it. As the monster charged, Li would combine its momentum with his own weight to drive his sword straight through the chieftain's body. When the attack came, Li focused all his power into one point and pushed forward. His sword pierced through the chieftain, killing it instantly. Right after, the system popped up, telling Li that he had learned a new skill called stabbing added to his level 2 swordsmanship, and congratulated him for finishing the death mission. Back in the lobby, Yeziel saw Li return alive and immediately rushed to hug him. But Sejong suddenly pushed her aside in panic and grabbed Li instead. Sejong, overwhelmed, confessed he had always believed Li would survive the death mission. Both Li and Yeziel were baffled by Sejong's sudden change of behavior. Sejong, still nervous, admitted that even a deadly mission couldn't stop Li, the strongest person around, from coming back. Li felt annoyed by Sejong's act and wanted to teach him a lesson, but held back. Then, a player stepped forward and asked if Li had truly completed the mission. He said he was glad Li was safe, but was surprised that Li's level was still stuck at 2 despite supposedly finishing such a tough challenge. Others started doubting if Li really cleared the mission or if it was just like the earlier event with the hologram rabbit. Li's mind drifted back to his past, remembering how the world seemed determined to keep the weak down. He recalled how in school, even though he worked hard and scored top marks, no one believed him. Instead, they accused him of cheating and called him a pathetic orphan. Even now, people didn't trust Li. They believed he must have hidden somewhere safe until time ran out, finishing the mission without really trying. One player said it made sense because someone as low level as Li couldn't possibly fight well, so he must have just gotten lucky. Hearing this, Li realized that some people's minds don't change easily, and though he was angry, he chose to stay calm and not react. Just as Li was about to speak, Yeziel stepped forward and told everyone to stop gossiping and doubting Li's skills since he had already proven himself by surviving the death mission. Watching Yeziel, Sejong suddenly jumped in and agreed with her. He said they had failed to celebrate the great return of Li, the strongest player around, and instead, they spoiled the mood and lost their heads. Li looked at Sejong, confused by his sudden behavior, thinking Sejong was the craziest person there. Still, Li smiled quietly, feeling a bit comforted knowing some people were truly on his side. Li thought to himself that no matter what others thought of him, he wanted everyone to survive in the tower. To make that happen, he needed to prove something important to them. So, Li spoke up and said he had something to show. Then, he pulled out a bright red sword called the Indomitable Sword, a rare weapon that boosted attack power by 15%. Everyone was shocked to see Li had such a powerful sword. They felt like he had a secret cheat. Junsong said he was surprised Li still had the poison apples and admitted Li really was as impressive as Yeziel said. Li just shrugged and said it was all luck. Junsong then said that the rare and powerful sword Lee had gotten was way more useful for surviving than just gaining experience points. But Lee reminded them all that they almost let him die, which made everyone suddenly nervous. Juno stepped forward and agreed with Lee, admitting that he had tried to excuse their actions by thinking sending Lee to the death mission was necessary. But deep down, Juno knew it was selfish. They only cared about saving themselves and didn't think about Lee. Even though they all realized that picking the lowest level player, Lee, was basically condemning him, they still pushed him into danger just to protect themselves. Juno bowed his head deeply to Lee, apologizing for everything he and the others had done. With tears in his eyes, he said how relieved he was that Lee had survived. As Lee watched Juno's sincere apology, another player named Co. Eun-jin suddenly cut in, telling Juno he didn't need to go that far because someone had to be chosen anyway. She added that Lee came back alive with a rare item, so things had turned out okay after all. Juno got angry hearing that and snapped at Eun-jin, asking how she could say such a thing to Lee. He told her she should at least feel some guilt for what they put Lee through. Eun-jin just smiled and shot back that Juno had no right to judge since he had also voted for Lee to take the death mission. Right then, Lee stepped between them, interrupting the argument. He said he wasn't bringing up the past to blame anyone, but to prevent it from happening again. Lee warned everyone that during the voting, the tower was clearly trying to create division, sowing distrust and conflict among them, probably just to watch them fall apart. Everyone was stunned by Lee's words, and he quickly added that his survival was a chance for all of them. He said that by making it through, he had shown that they could go against the tower's plans if they stuck together. Junsong then asked if Lee had any plans moving forward. Lee answered that he would find a way to help as many people survive as possible, and they would keep climbing the tower, step by step, higher and higher, until one day they could all return to their normal lives. Hearing this, everyone agreed and felt inspired to face the challenges ahead as a team. Yeziel added that to make this happen, everyone had to unite and support each other, and the group nodded in agreement. Juno quietly admired Lee, thinking he was kind-hearted to say that even after being betrayed by them. Juno also realized they shouldn't have judged Lee just because of his low level. Suddenly, Kumkum appeared and interrupted, announcing that their next mission would be a survival game. Everyone was shocked to see him, as they thought he had left for good. One player joked that Kumkum must be back to hand out stat points again. Lee asked Kumkum what exactly a survival game meant, and Kumkum explained that the level 2 mission would take place among the 15 players in the lobby, and it would be a battle royale. Everyone was shocked to hear this. Seeing their reactions, Kumkum quickly reassured them that since it was just a low-level mission, it would be a gentle challenge, so they didn't need to be too worried and told them to stay positive. Then, Kumkum went on to explain the rules. He said the level 2 mission would have 16 real players and 16 doppelgangers, making 32 participants in total. Their goal was to eliminate all the doppelgangers. Kumkum warned that the doppelgangers would have the same stats and even the same memories, so spotting them wouldn't be easy. The most important rule was number 3. Players wouldn't get any rewards for killing doppelgangers, but if they killed another player, they would earn stat points and gold as a reward. Kumkum explained that this mission was really a chance for everyone to level up, but as soon as he said that, the group disagreed. They felt Kumkum was just telling them to fight and kill each other. To make things worse, Kumkum warned that if nobody made a kill within 30 minutes, they would all be pulled back to the lobby to face a huge disaster. Right then, he summoned a giant monster of unknown strength right in front of them. Everyone froze, shocked by the terrifying creature. The monster immediately unleashed a massive attack, but the players dodged just in time. Still, the power of that single attack left everyone stunned and scared. One hit from the monster could easily end their lives. Fear spread quickly among the players. One of them couldn't believe they were expected to fight such a beast after barely making it through the first floor. Panic took over the group, and no one knew what to do next. Watching all this, Lee realized things were getting worse. Everyone was too scared and tense, making it even harder for them to work as a team. Just then, the monster swung a heavy punch at one of the players, who froze in terror, unable to react. At that moment, Lee jumped in and saved the player just in time. The saved player was grateful and thanked Lee, but Lee was puzzled. Why was the monster attacking before the second level mission even began? Then it hit him. The monster was putting on a show, trying to scare everyone and make them take the upcoming mission seriously. Lee figured this was just a warning and the monster didn't really want to hurt them. But suddenly, the monster slammed a powerful blow that sent 3 players flying and hurt them badly. Lee was confused and couldn't understand what was going on anymore. When the others tried to fight back, Their attacks barely scratched the monster. No matter how many times they struck, it made no difference. Lee was annoyed. He had thought the monster's first attack was just for show, but now it seemed like the monster was actually trying to kill them before the mission even started. Yahello shouted to Lee that her mana was almost gone, and soon she wouldn't be able to heal the injured players anymore. Lee noticed that no one had died yet, but he knew this couldn't last much longer if things kept going like this. Just then, the monster was about to launch a huge attack, but Lee told everyone to move back. He was going to take care of it. Juno warned Lee to stay away from the monster, but Lee thought to himself that there was no time to worry about what others thought. If he didn't stop that attack now, everyone would die. Gathering all his remaining strength, Lee used his indomitable sword and his stabbing skill together, pouring all his energy into one massive strike that completely destroyed the monster. Everyone was stunned by what they saw, and even Lee was amazed at what he had just done. Cheers broke out as the monster was finally defeated, but Lee started wondering if his sword was really that powerful. Just then, the system appeared and warned Lee that he would be exhausted for 3 minutes because he had pushed his body beyond its limits. Without any energy left, Lee collapsed right away. 3 minutes later, the system announced that Lee's exhaustion was over, and Lee slowly woke up. Everyone was gathered around him, worried but also amazed at what he had just done to the monster. Juno wiped tears from his eyes and told Lee he couldn't believe how humble Lee was, even though he was so strong. Juno also joked that Lee's fainting at the end was like a perfect performance. Lee stood up and asked what had happened to him and the monster they had been fighting. Just then, Kum appeared, excitedly explaining that the monster had been sent away. He said the attack was just a warning to show them what would happen if they didn't follow the mission's rules. Lee realized the monster was only there to scare them into paying attention. Kum then said it wasn't very thrilling since everyone was acting too friendly, even though they almost died moments ago. He added with a wicked grin that since someone had to be killed every 30 minutes, the person standing next to you could be your killer. Everyone grew nervous, scared by Kum's words. Kum smiled and said it had shared its warning, and now it was time to leave. With a cheerful wave, it said goodbye to everyone. Lee felt angry that the monster had been so obvious about its plans right in front of them. He wondered if there was anything they could do to change the situation. After a moment, Juno spoke up, saying if they couldn't find the doppelgangers soon, they'd end up killing each other, which he really wanted to avoid. Another player agreed, saying they needed a quick solution. Then Lee stepped forward with an idea. Everyone should mark each other, so they could tell who was who. One player questioned this, pointing out that since the doppelgangers had the same memories, how would marking them help? After thinking for a bit, Lee said he had a plan to get them through the mission. Curious, everyone asked what it was. Lee then announced that he would be the one to hunt down and kill all the doppelgangers himself. Everyone was stunned when Lee made his bold announcement. He explained that they shouldn't do anything on their own, but instead gather at the highest spot on the second floor. He warned that if anyone else started killing, that person was probably a doppelganger, and they should all team up to take them down. A player named on Secheng, who was level 9, asked Lee if that was really his entire plan. Eunjin then spoke up, saying she knew Lee was skilled despite his low level, but she didn't understand why they had to blindly follow his plan. Lee looked at Eunjin and reminded her about what Kum had told them earlier, that killing doppelgangers gave no rewards, but killing other players gave stats and gold. He pointed out that although the mission said to fight doppelgangers, the tower's true goal was to force them to turn on each other. Lee said he was done being tricked by the tower and believed his plan was the best way to handle this mess. Eunjin asked how that could be the best choice, but before she could say more, Junsong cut in and said he agreed with Lee's idea. Junsong spoke up, telling everyone that following Lee's plan would definitely help them avoid a lot of harm. Eunjin was caught off guard by Junsong's confidence. Junsong then said, seriously looking at Lee, that since Lee wanted to handle all the doppelganger hunting himself, it must mean Lee had a way to tell players and doppelgangers apart. Lee smiled and admitted he did have a method to tell them apart. Soon after, an announcement rang out. The second floor mission was starting, and they had to kill at least one person within 30 minutes. At that exact moment, someone moved ahead, and it was none other than Seong, who was grumbling to himself about why they were supposed to do nothing except climb to the highest spot, and why he even bothered following Lee's orders in the first place. Suddenly, a faint sound reached his ears, and he quickly slipped behind a tree as approaching footsteps drew closer. Just as Seong tensed up, ready to strike whoever it was, a familiar voice called out to him, revealing it was Lee. Lee casually remarked that Seong's shoulders were far wider than the tree he was trying to hide behind, and Seong immediately relaxed, smiling in relief and saying he was glad it was the boss. In the very next instant, before that relief could fade, Lee coldly cut Seong straight down the middle without a hint of hesitation or regret. Only moments before all of this, the second mission had officially begun. Lee checked his guidebook, which told him he was the first player to reach a certain level of sensitivity. Because of that, he earned a new skill called Impeccable Senses, which would help him spot doppelgangers. Lee felt relieved. He had been a little nervous after claiming he could tell players from doppelgangers, and this skill showed up just in time. Though happy to get the skill, Lee felt a bit regretful too, since he had to spend a lot of his stat points to unlock it. After investing a lot of his stats into sensitivity, Lee finally raised it to level 50 and unlocked the skill called Impeccable Senses. This skill sharpened all of Lee's senses to an incredible level, allowing him to gather detailed info about anyone nearby within a certain range. Lee felt thrilled. He had spent nearly half his gold to get this, but now everything around him seemed clearer, like his world had a brand new filter. Feeling great, Lee focused his enhanced senses and soon heard a voice far off. Squinting into the distance, he saw Seong walking toward him. Lee was amazed he could hear Seong so clearly, even though Seong was about 500 meters away. But then, a terrible smell hit Lee's nose, and he quickly covered his mouth, almost gagging from the awful stench. Looking closer, Lee realized right away that Seong wasn't the real player at all. He was a doppelganger. Right after, the system popped up and told Lee had just killed one of the doppelgangers. 15 doppelgangers and 16 players were left. It reminded him again that each player had to kill someone within 30 minutes. Lee realized the doppelganger acted so real until the very end, and he felt a little bad about killing it. But he pushed those thoughts aside, glad that now he could clearly tell who was real thanks to his new skill. Lee hoped everyone else was following his plan too. Lee felt relieved that everyone had agreed to follow his plan, especially after Junsong supported it. Still, he couldn't shake off his worry. Anything could happen at any moment. He just hoped everyone would make it safely to a high point on the map before trouble struck. Just as Lee finished speaking, a system alert rang out announcing a player's death, and the message left him stunned, his mind instantly racing as he questioned whether the doppelgangers had begun slaughtering players or if another human was behind it. With Seong's name surfacing as a troubling possibility he couldn't ignore, yet no matter how much he thought, he realized there was no way to learn the truth on the spot. So abandoning hesitation, Lee sprinted ahead, convinced that finding the killer quickly was the only option left to him. And to gain a better view, he scaled a towering tree and swept his gaze across the terrain, where he soon spotted a motionless body sprawled on the ground with a lone figure standing beside it. And the moment he recognized the figure as a doppelganger, Lee leapt down and rushed in without pause, striking it down before it could react, triggering another announcement declaring the doppelganger's death, which made Lee release a breath he hadn't realized he was holding, thankful he had arrived in time to stop further bloodshed. And after offering a brief prayer for the fallen player, something caught his attention as he inspected the doppelganger's weapon, because it didn't align with the fatal wound at all, which had clearly been made by an arrow. And as that realization settled in, Lee noticed Junsong standing far away, bow drawn, and aimed straight ahead. Lee immediately slipped behind the tree, his thoughts spiraling as he wondered if there was yet another attacker lurking nearby. And when he focused on the figure in the distance, he quickly realized it was a player with an arrow embedded in his back, making Lee question whether that injury had been caused by the doppelganger instead. So he cautiously called out to Junsong and asked if he was still alive, then warned him to stop moving. But Junsong, clearly shaken, replied that although he didn't want out Lee, he had no way to confirm whether Lee was human or a doppelganger. So he insisted they keep their distance for safety, to which Lee responded that killing the doppelganger right in front of him should be more than enough proof. And after a brief pause filled with tension, Junsong finally accepted his words, only to suddenly lose strength and collapse, forcing Lee to rush over in panic to check on him. And after they steadied themselves and began moving again, Junsong apologized with a heavy voice, blaming himself for letting the doppelganger escape earlier and believing that his mistake had led to others losing their lives, admitting how terrifying it was to know something wearing his face was harming innocent people. But Lee firmly reassured him that none of it was his fault and that everyone trapped here was merely a victim of the tower, telling him their only priority now was surviving and escaping. When Lee suddenly sensed movement and spotted two figures approaching, revealing themselves as Juno and Yiziel, who looked relieved to see them safe and immediately expressed their concern after hearing that two players had already died. And as Yiziel stepped forward and offered to heal Junsong, Lee abruptly moved in front of him and ordered Junsong to step back, declaring that the two standing before them were doppelgangers, causing Yiziel and Juno to freeze in shock for a heartbeat before their expressions twisted and they openly revealed their true nature. The pair didn't hesitate for even a second and lunged straight at Lee. While Juno spoke with a twisted smile, saying it saddened him and asking whether Lee was still upset about how things had turned out earlier, as Junsong, standing nearby, calmly declared that he would handle the remaining doppelganger himself. Yet despite the chaos, Lee's thoughts raced as he questioned why the doppelgangers would confront him so boldly, especially Yiziel, who carried memories and should have known exactly how dangerous Lee truly was. And while the two kept pressing him without pause, Lee was suddenly snapped out of his thoughts when an arrow shot toward him at high speed, which he narrowly avoided. Though the tip grazed his face and drew a thin line of blood, and just then a mocking voice echoed through the area, lamenting that it was a shame because he had believed the situation was already checkmate, a voice that unmistakably belonged to Junsong, who now stood grinning cruelly with his bow, aimed directly at Lee. As the two doppelgangers quickly fell back to his side, and all three locked their gazes on Lee at once, revealing that earlier, right after Lee had killed a doppelganger, someone had been secretly watching him from afar, and that observer had been Junsong himself, because everything up to this point had been a carefully laid trap, one Lee had walked into completely, with the arrow lodged in Junsong's back being self-inflicted to sell the act, and with a casual apology. For getting a little carried away, Junsong smoothly changed the subject and asked Lee what he was feeling now, betrayal, helplessness, or rage, before breaking into unsettling laughter that rang through the clearing. At that instant, Junsong was caught off guard by sudden laughter echoing through the clearing, laughter that came from Lee himself, and Lee calmly spoke up, saying he had been wondering how long Junsong planned to keep pretending, adding that Junsong seemed far more unhinged than he had expected, which made Junsong scoff and accuse Lee of acting as if he had known the truth from the very beginning, only for Lee to flash a confident grin and explain that he could see every player's status window, openly labeling Junsong as a murderer, causing Junsong to fall silent for a brief moment before remarking that this revelation made things interesting, asking if the tower had granted Lee such an ability and admitting his envy. But Lee cut him off, saying he was tired of pointless chatter, then bluntly questioned why Junsong was doing all this and whether gold and stats truly mattered enough to justify killing real people. To which Junsong casually replied that he didn't need a reason at all, claiming that in this beautiful world, killing brought no punishment but instead generous rewards. And with a twisted smile, he loosed another arrow at Lee while admitting he could no longer restrain himself after learning that truth, as Lee briefly wondered if something deeper had driven Junsong to this point before rejecting that thought entirely, concluding that Junsong had simply worn a mask until now and was nothing more than a bloodthirsty lunatic. And, as the battle fully erupted between the two sides, Lee quickly found himself under heavy pressure while facing all three at once, realizing that Junsong still hadn't revealed everything he was capable of, making the fight even harder, especially because of their formation. A healer backing them up, an archer attacking from afar, and a close-range fighter pressing him nonstop, left Lee with almost no room to breathe or counter. Lee spoke up calmly, saying he didn't know how Junsong had managed to get the doppelgangers on his side, but was clear that Junsong had planned everything thoroughly, to which Junsong replied that landing a valuable target required this level of preparation, admitting that Lee was far stronger than expected and claiming that this only made things better, since he could now slowly enjoy watching Lee suffer before dying. And as Junsong prepared to strike again, he ordered the doppelgangers to move in. Yet, the moment all three rushed forward, Lee activated his heightened senses and instantly grasped how perfectly their roles were synchronized, though he scoffed at the idea, believing that teamwork meant nothing when faced with absolute power. And with a decisive swing, Lee sliced through one doppelganger. Then, as the second tried to heal, Lee severed her arm mid-action and finished her off without hesitation, prompting the system to announce the deaths of two doppelgangers at once, which caused Junsong to completely lose his composure as he suddenly dropped to his knees, shocking Lee, and with tears welling in his eyes, Junsong begged for mercy, claiming that greed had consumed him, that he had lost himself chasing rewards, grown impatient after witnessing Lee's strength, and crossed a line he never should have approached, pleading desperately to be forgiven just this once. But in the very next heartbeat, Junsong attempted a surprise attack, only for it to fail, instantly as Lee had already anticipated it. And without pausing for even a moment, Lee ended Junsong's life, turning the hunter who had carefully laid his trap into the very prey he once sought to capture. At that moment, a system alert flashed, announcing the death of another player, and Lee stood frozen, silently coming to terms with the fact that he had just ended the life of an actual human, when suddenly red text filled his vision, informing him that the player who had accepted the role of Star Killer was now dead and that Lee had been chosen as the replacement, a revelation that left him completely shaken. And before he could fully grasp it, the system explained that accepting the title would grant him powerful stat boosts along with the loyalty of nearby doppelgangers. Yet Li remained stunned, barely aware of his surroundings, until a presence manifested before him, causing him to tense as he questioned who this figure could be. And then a strikingly beautiful woman appeared, extending her hand and calmly asking whether he wished to accept the offer, which only deepened Li's confusion as everything began to click, making him realize that this was exactly how Junsong had gained control over the doppelgangers. And although Li set that thought aside and examined the rewards being offered, he couldn't deny how tempting and overwhelmingly generous they were. But as he reflected more carefully, Li admitted to himself that while killing doppelgangers hadn't weighed heavily on him since they weren't truly human, the tower would eventually force him into battles against real people, possibly even other star killers. And despite understanding the advantages and the danger ahead, Li made his choice, firmly rejecting the challenge with unwavering resolve, declaring that no matter what, he refused to walk the same twisted path as Junsong or become a deranged monster obsessed with murder. A short while later, Li finally arrived at the meeting point and found the rest of the group already waiting, and almost immediately, Seong popped up in front of him with an overly cute expression, complaining about why Li had taken so long, which made Li briefly wonder if life would be easier if he just snapped and eliminated Seong on the spot. But pushing that thought aside, Li praised everyone for their efforts and thanked them for trusting and following his plan, only for the players to quickly ask what their next move should be and whether Li truly had the ability to tell doppelgangers apart. And just as Li was about to answer, another voice suddenly echoed out, politely thanking everyone for gathering there, a voice Li instantly recognized as his own, belonging to none other than his doppelganger, causing panic to spread through the group as people froze, unsure which Li they were supposed to believe, some even asking if this situation had also been part of Li's prediction, while the two identical figures stood facing each other in silence. And inside, the real Li grimly acknowledged that things had become far more complicated than planned, remembering that this exact outcome was why he had wanted to deal with the doppelganger earlier, only for everything to fall apart due to an unforeseen factor, Junsong's interference. And as the two Lis locked eyes, Li realized this had turned into a mental battle, a chess game where one wrong move could doom him. Just as one of the players nervously asked Li to explain everything, questioning whether he had truly killed the doppelgangers as promised, and demanding to know exactly who among them were real and who were not. Li quickly ran through the facts in his head, realizing that 8 individuals in total were now tied to either a fallen doppelganger or a dead player, and that if he openly named the 5 doppelgangers he had personally eliminated, their identities would be exposed without room for doubt, which meant that proving this alone should have been enough to confirm that he was the real player. Yet a serious flaw appeared immediately, because both Li and his double possessed the same knowledge about which players and doppelgangers had died. And when they spoke at the same time with identical answers, the crowd was left stunned by how perfectly their statements matched, and while the Real Li was still searching for a way out of this mess, the doppelgangers seized the initiative, urging everyone to think logically as he began laying out his own explanation for why he was the genuine Li. And as the group listened to his confident reasoning, doubts slowly crept in, causing some to waver and question their beliefs, even though a few still remained unconvinced and watched the two Lis with growing unease. The doppelganger kept talking, explaining that according to the other Li, the Junsong standing with them was a fake, which could only mean that the real Junsong had already been killed by Li himself. He reminded everyone that Junsong had been the highest level player among them, the one who had pushed them forward and acted like their leader, so the idea that the strongest person there had died so easily was hard to swallow. With a sharp tone, the doppelganger ended by asking whether anyone could truly place their trust in someone who had already murdered a teammate. At once, murmurs spread through the group as players argued among themselves, while the doppelganger Li silently felt relieved, since he had no idea how the real Junsong died, but was happy the crowd was leaning his way. Seizing the moment, he suddenly pointed straight at Li and declared that Li was the real doppelganger. The players responded that they had heard enough and insisted they should deal with the fake Li immediately before more doppelgangers were killed. Seong objected at once, saying that doing so would also label him as fake, which he clearly wasn't, and Yizil backed him up, arguing that they couldn't decide anything without listening to both Lis first. Juno also agreed, whamming everyone to proceed carefully, but others pushed back, saying there was no time left since the catastrophe would arrive within minutes. Throughout it all, Li stayed silent, calmly observing, and deep down he admitted that his doppelganger had played this situation impressively, choosing almost the perfect move to corner him. Li suddenly stepped forward and broke the tension, calmly agreeing that the doppelganger was correct and openly admitting that he was the one who had killed the real Junsong. Hearing that, the doppelganger sneered and asked if Li had finally surrendered, saying it was disappointing to see him give up so easily. Inside, though Li knew there was a truth his double had completely missed, and without hesitating, he drew his sword and shouted that Junseong had been a traitor who had been murdering players from the very start. As those words left his mouth, Li swung his blade straight through Junseong's body, instantly throwing his doppelganger into panic at the sight. Eunji cried out in shock as Junseong was cut down, while the doppelganger, furious and flustered, pulled out his weapon and demanded to know what Li thought he was doing, accusing Gin of acting wildly because he was cornered. Before the chaos could explode further, a firm voice cut through the noise, telling everyone to stop, and it was Juno, who then turned to Li and asked him to explain exactly what he meant when he called Junseong a traitor. He realized that if Li was right, then the one attacking was the real Li. Juno also saw that by gathering everyone together, Li had cleverly put the players in control, because if a doppelganger killed someone, they immediately showed their true nature, stopping them from being reckless. Juno thought to himself that if Li could tell who the doppelgangers were, he could easily prove he was the real Li by killing one of them. But Juno was still confused about why Li called Junseong a traitor. So, he raised his voice and asked Li if Junseong really had killed people. Li nodded and said Juno was right. Junseong was like a demon hiding behind a mask of kindness, waiting for the right moment to strike. Hearing this, Eunji got angry because Junseong had always helped her. She shouted at Li, asking how he could insult Junseong like that, then swung her sword at Li, vowing she wouldn't forgive him. But just as she attacked, an arrow suddenly pierced her back, shot by none other than Junseong himself, the person she trusted the most. Eunji fell to the ground, and the system announced that a player had died. Now, there were only 12 players left and 11 doppelgangers. Everyone was shocked by what happened. Li was surprised too. He hadn't expected the doppelganger to still be strong after Li had slashed him. Then, Junseong's doppelganger laughed loudly, saying he loved seeing their shocked faces. But before he could celebrate, Secheng sneaked behind him and struck him down. The doppelganger died instantly, and the system announced that one of them was gone. Secheng apologized to Li for doubting him and asked what their next move should be. Li was caught off guard by Secheng's change of heart. Meanwhile, another player was shocked to learn that Junseong was a doppelganger, which made it impossible to know who the real Li was. Suddenly, all the doppelgangers drew their swords, ready to fight the real players. The players looked to Li, asking what to do next, and promising to follow his orders. Li felt a wave of deja vu wash over him, and decided it was time to share his final plan with everyone. Just as he began to speak, Li's doppelganger appeared behind him and declared that it was now do or die. It swung its sword at Li, who managed to block the blow. While battling his double, Li said he planned to take all the gold from the doppelganger to boost his own strength, and that the same fate awaited the others. As Li spoke, the real players launched a strong attack, overpowering their doppelgangers easily since they had all grown stronger than the day before. After a while, the players managed to defeat all the doppelgangers. As they caught their breath, Li thought about how lucky they were. The doppelgangers had the same stats as when they first arrived on the second floor, but since the players had boosted their stats with gold, they finished the mission without losing anyone else. Meanwhile, Secheng was visibly angry and frustrated, blaming Junseong for the deaths. He told Li that if it weren't for that traitor, they could have made it through without losing anyone. Li realized Secheng was especially upset because he had been in a team with Junseong. Li himself felt disappointed too, since his goal was to clear the floors safely with no casualties. Li then thought about the other groups in different regions. They probably didn't have someone like him with a guidebook, so they might face even worse challenges and more star killers like Junseong. He knew the battles ahead would get tougher, but he believed his special ability to read the guide was meant for a reason. Even though some experiences had been harsh, Li felt determined to protect as many people as possible, especially those who trusted him. At that moment, Secheng thanked Li, saying he only survived because of him. Li smiled and replied that it was actually everyone's teamwork that made it possible. Secheng looked at Li and said, "You're still level 2 even after doing so much, so you must have a special ability that's slowing your leveling down." Li was surprised that Secheng had figured it out so quickly. He thought to himself that Secheng's careful thinking and good judgment would be really helpful going forward. Then, Secheng bowed deeply and sincerely apologized for doubting Li and underestimating him. One by one, the other players also bowed and said sorry to Li. Li looked a bit uncomfortable and told them there was no need to apologize. Just then, Seong burst out laughing and joked that everyone else was bad at spotting talent, and that they should have been like him, jumping on Li's fast track from the start. Right after, Yizil stepped forward and said she was actually the first to see how amazing Li was. Juno added, wiping tears, that he also wanted to apologize again. Li felt a mix of frustration and amusement hearing all this. Secheng then spoke again, admitting it might sound bold after everything, but he asked Li to take charge and lead them from now on. Li was caught off guard for a moment, but soon smiled and agreed to Secheng's suggestion. After a short wait, the system began calculating how much gold each player earned based on their effort. When the results were out, everyone cheered happily at the gold they received. Seong couldn't help but boast loudly that he got 2,000 gold coins, showing off to everyone. Watching this, Li thought to himself that since everyone followed his plan, they all ended up with some gold, which made him happy. But what really excited Li was that he earned a huge 12,500 gold coins for contributing the most. While checking his shop, Li got a system notification saying that because he had more than 10,000 gold coins, his shop rank had gone up, unlocking more items to buy. Li realized this was how the system worked. To get rare items, he needed a higher rank shop. He decided to focus on buying skill-up items. Just then, Li's skill level 4 skill-up jumped to level 3, and his basic swordsmanship improved too. Li thought back to when he had used a higher-level sword skill without realizing it, but it passed out right after. Now, knowing he could buy that powerful skill for just 5,000 gold, Li felt it was an amazing deal for such strength. After finishing his shopping, Li spotted Yiziel nearby and quickly handed her 1,200 gold coins. Yiziel was surprised and asked why he gave her so much, but Li just smiled and said she deserved it. He reminded her how tough their battles against the kobolds and doppelgangers would have been without her. Li added that in a world where survival meant taking lives, it was because of Yiziel's kindness and support that they could still trust and help each other. Hearing this, Yiziel's eyes filled with tears, and she promised to get stronger to protect everyone. Right then, her healing skill leveled up. Li also gave Seong 200 gold coins, which confused Seong at first. Li told him to stop messing around and to keep up the good work. Li thought Seong was getting pretty capable and could be useful if he helped him grow stronger, but it was best not to make enemies of annoying people. Suddenly, a beam of light shone from Seong, who turned around with a cute, almost tearful expression, saying, "Anything you wish is my command." Li, seeing this, felt a burst of anger and was tempted to test his new level 3 basic sword skill on Seong right then and there. After a short while, everyone arrived on the 3rd floor and the new mission kicked off. The system announced that this mission was a siege battle, where they would face players from different regions for the first time. Their goal was to destroy the castle and take control of the altar located on the 3rd floor. They had 24 hours to complete it, but the system didn't say what would happen if they failed. Once the announcement ended, everyone received a return crystal, a special item that could only be used on the 3rd floor and only for a limited time. One player quickly asked if they had to fight and kill others, while another wondered what the return crystal was used for. As everyone took in the news, Li suddenly noticed something important. He quickly called out to Seong, reminding him about Seong's promise to do anything for Li. Li drew his sword, and Seong's face instantly showed fear. Moments later, Seong was sprinting uphill, muttering to himself that Li was being too intense and that he could have just talked to him instead. Seong thought Li could have reassured him that dying wouldn't be permanent. But Li already knew this from his guidebook. It said that if a player died on the 3rd floor, the return crystal would teleport them back to the start. Seong suddenly remembered that Li had promised him 100 gold coins if he went ahead to scout for the team. Feeling pumped, Seong stood in front of the big door and shouted that he was ready to smash everything on the 3rd floor. He started hitting the door with powerful punches, and the system notified him that the castle gate's durability was dropping little by little with each hit. After a final strong punch, the gate finally burst open. But just then, the system warned Seong that the gate would reset in 2 seconds, and sure enough, it snapped back to its full strength. Confident, Seong stepped inside, thinking no gate could hold him back. Looking around, he spotted 2 guards watching from the castle walls and about 10 people standing near the altar in the distance. He remembered Li telling him not to kill anyone there or else the others would figure out the return crystal secret. But Seong thought the people in front of him were just weaklings afraid of him. He told himself he was going to crush them all. Before he could act, a sudden powerful strike hit Seong's face hard, making blood drip down, shocking him instantly. Seong lay on the ground, stunned and confused about what had just hit him. Looking up, he saw someone aiming a gun right at him, and in the next instant, he was dead. A short while later, Seong came back to the group and told them everything that happened. Li was shocked to hear there was someone with a gun, and Seong added that the bullets were magical and caused serious pain. Li thought the whole situation was insane. Guns weren't supposed to be available yet. Even Secheng, who was a soldier, didn't have one. But then Li considered another possibility. Maybe the person had earned a legendary weapon as a reward from the 2nd floor star killer mission, which granted special gear to those who completed it. Li was thinking the fight ahead would be really tough when Yiziel suddenly grabbed his shoulders and told him not to worry. She had his back. Right then, the other players also spoke up, promising they were behind him too. Seeing their support made Li smile, and he raised his voice to explain the plan they would follow. Later that night, inside the castle, a man was kneeling and on the verge of tears while a woman sat on him like he was a chair. The rest of the players stood frozen, too scared to move. Meanwhile, Li stayed far from the castle, thinking about the great advantage his impeccable senses skill gave him. Using it, he spotted 2 guards on the castle walls near the gate. As Li scanned the area, Seong walked past and shouted at the guards, greeting them like old foes. Yiziel warned Li that if Seong went back, the enemies might figure out the return crystal's power, but Li said the enemies would only guess. It was more likely they'd think Seong alone had that ability. Suddenly, the 2 guards fired arrows at Seong. Seong was caught off guard since things were different from his first visit. Just then, Li appeared and sliced all the arrows in half. He told Yiziel that the enemies didn't fully understand how Seong could come back from death, so they now had a chance to strike. Li jumped up on his Seong's shoulders and launched himself toward the guards. As he got close, he slashed their chests, seriously wounding them. Juno reminded everyone that the enemies would soon figure out the return crystal after their first failed attack, so they needed to act fast and finish this quickly. Seong shouted for everyone to rush the castle, saying this was their moment. He bragged he could break the gate with just 5 punches and told the group to stay close because the gate would shut if they took too long. But right as Seong prepared a powerful hit, a bullet fired through the door hit him in the chest again. The system then announced the gate was broken beyond repair. Yiziel healed Seong and urged him to stay strong. Li was shocked, but as he looked around, one of the injured guards on the ground warned Li, saying he didn't understand why Li spared them, but that mercy would cost their lives. The guard warned Li that if he stayed so kind, the woman with the gun would definitely take advantage of him. Curious, Li quickly used his skill to check her stats. He was shocked when he saw her name, Sun Seoyan, and even more surprised to find out she was a star killer. She was already level 13, which made Li wonder if she had wiped out everyone on the 2nd floor. Before he could think more, Seoyan fired her gun at him, hitting his shoulder and causing serious pain. Li quickly ducked behind cover and gulped down a healing potion. He was stunned that she could shoot so accurately from such a long distance. Realizing how dangerous she was, Li felt grateful head prepared by wearing Kala's leather armor for protection. Watching her mana, Li noticed each magic bullet used 10 MP. He figured that since she probably shopped at the same rank as him, she couldn't buy mana potions yet. Climbing down from the tower, Li thought that Seoyan only had about 13 shots left, so he and his team had to push forward and break through fast. About half an hour earlier, one player asked Li how they were supposed to get past the magic bullets and reach the altar safely. Secheng replied that they would move carefully, using cover and zigzagging to avoid getting hit. Li added that the woman probably couldn't shoot bullets powerful enough to instantly knock Seong out, since each magic bullet likely used her mana. Juno agreed and pointed out that how much mana she had left would be key. Li nodded and told everyone they needed to be ready to take at least 1 hit from her bullets. Back to the present, a bullet struck one player, but he was smiling because his armor absorbed the damage. Then, the team rushed towards Soyeon, who fired a rapid volley of bullets to slow them down. Realizing her gun alone wouldn't finish them off, Seoyan ordered her teammates to block the attackers and charge at Li's group. Li knew this battle would decide everything. Some of their teammates might fall to those magic bullets, so they had to reach the altar fast. During the fight, Li skillfully blocked every attack, but suddenly a bullet shot straight at him. Just before it hit, Juno deflected the bullet, surprising Seoyan. Juno urged Li to hurry to the altar, but as he spoke, a bullet struck Juno's head, sending him back to the starting point. Li was filled with rage as he watched more and more people fall one by one. He realized Seoyan must be fully aware that those she killed would come back again. But what made him even angrier was the cold, uncaring look on her face, as if she didn't mind killing over and over. Just then, Seoyan smiled to herself, thinking this group was more challenging than she expected. Seeing that smile made Li's blood boil. Without hesitation, he unleashed his level 3 basic swordsmanship, cutting down everyone in front of him. Then, with fierce determination, he charged straight at Seoyan, their weapons crashing fiercely in the center of the altar. As the battle raged on, Seong shouted to his enemies that they were in big trouble now, leaving them puzzled. He explained that since Li had reached the altar, they no longer had to hold back. With that, Seong unleashed his level 2 stone fist, sending his foes flying. Meanwhile, between Li and Seoyan, she expressed disbelief that Li was so strong despite being only level 2 and asked who he really was. Li quickly shifted the topic, pointing out how unusual it was for Seoyan to already be level 13 so early in the game. Lee then stepped onto the altar, and the system notified him that he had occupied it, but 3 players needed to stand there to fully claim it. The system also said he had to push the opposing players off the altar. Lee realized how to take control, but first needed to figure out how to get Seoyin off. Just then, Seoyin fired her gun, but Lee dodged the bullet at the last second and counterattacked, only for her to block it. As they fought, Seoyin grew surprised at Lee's quick dodges, thinking maybe he could predict her moves. Lee thought about Juno, one of the strongest players around and a top swordsman like himself. Juno was famous as a genius table tennis player, known for his amazing ability to predict where the ball would go during fast rallies between pros. At high-level matches, players didn't just watch the ball, they read their opponent's posture and gazed to guess the next move. Juno's skill in prediction earned him the nickname, the Genius of Prediction, and Lee realized he could use this idea to dodge Seoyin's attacks. At that moment, Lee managed to avoid all her strikes and landed a strong slash that hit her, even though she was still standing. Seoyin grew annoyed, knowing Lee's stats were higher, but just then Secheng and the others called out that they had finished their fights. Seoyin added they needed to end this quickly before more enemies showed up. Seoyin was shocked to learn the return crystal could revive fallen players, and Lee confirmed it, but told her that knowing it didn't help now. Lee decided that even if Seoyin had a hidden skill that could land a hit, he could handle the damage. He was ready to take the risk and finish the fight right then and there. As Lee charged up his sword, Seoyin sneered and asked if he really thought he had one. Then, she quickly spent her gold coins to level up her shooting skill to level 4. Lee immediately realized he was in serious trouble and had to finish this now, but just as he rushed at her, Seoyin fired a perfect shot that hit Lee hard, completely wiping him out and sending him back to the 3rd floor starting point. The system then announced that the 3rd floor mission was over. A short while later, Lee returned to the castle and found Seoyin standing there looking downcast. Curious, Lee asked why Seoyin looked so upset, reminding him they had won the fight. Seoyin replied that although he felt he had carried the mission this time, the gold rewards were disappointingly small. Lee smiled quietly at Seoyin's complaint. In his mind, Lee thought that even though Seoyin's surprise counterattack had caught him off guard, he had managed to stab her with his sword at the same moment he was hit. Seoyin had warned she wouldn't forget Lee's name. After that, Yizil, Secheng, and Seoyin reached the altar and claimed it, securing their victory. Lee couldn't help but think about Seoyin again, feeling a chill run down his spine, hoping they would never cross paths again. Just then, Yizil called everyone's attention to the gate that had suddenly opened before them. When they looked through, they saw the group they had just fought trapped behind it. The system then warned that those who lost would now face a disaster, a deadly threat targeting players who hadn't managed a single kill. Suddenly, a mysterious, powerful monster appeared and wiped out everyone trapped beyond the gate. The players begged for help, and Yizil tried to reach through the gate to save them, but it blocked her touch. Helpless, she was forced to watch as they were all destroyed. The crowd froze in disbelief, unable to move or speak as they stared at what had just happened. A short while later, the system announced that only a single player from Zone C 1427 was still alive and that the remaining forces had been reshuffled. Hearing this, Lee felt a chill run through him, since the only person who had successfully killed players, including Lee's group, was Seoyin. As that thought crossed his mind, footsteps echoed from beyond the gate, and someone slowly emerged. Gasps spread through the group when they recognized the figure standing there. It was Seoyin herself. Almost immediately, the system declared that a brand new group had now been formed. Not long after, the surviving players arrived on the 4th floor, and one of them quickly pointed out that the area looked like a ruined, deserted city. At that instant, the system issued a new warning, stating that in 6 hours a catastrophic event would strike the cursed city. Their mission was to hunt down and eliminate every monster roaming the area, and then claim an escape portal. The system explained that portals would appear at random locations as monsters were defeated and stressed that only 20 portals would exist in total. It also warned them not to let anyone else use their portal, reminding them once again that they had only 6 hours to finish everything. When the announcement appeared, excitement spread through the players, and one of them laughed, saying it was finally time for a real monster hunting stage. He added that, after enduring the 2nd and 3rd floors, he was actually glad they could fight enemies instead of dealing with other trials. Another player chimed in, pointing out that since there were 20 escape portals and only 13 of them, there was no reason for anyone to clash with each other. Seoyin then spoke with confidence, claiming this floor was perfect for him, and boldly declared that he planned to wipe out every monster on the 4th floor. He urged everyone else to take advantage of the situation and gain as many levels as possible by slaughtering monsters nonstop. Yizil quickly cut in, stopping Seoyin mid-rant, and reminded everyone that the system had clearly stated they could not share their portals. Because of that rule, she reasoned, the number of monsters on the fourth floor would likely be limited, meaning they wouldn't appear endlessly. Juno nodded in agreement with her and added that if a single person activated multiple portals, others might be left behind with no way out. He also warned that the surplus of portals could be a hidden trick designed by the tower itself. Sechang then added that regardless of how many monsters they defeated, the smartest move was to enter a portal the moment it appeared. Hearing that, Juno raised his voice and insisted that they all make a promise. Once anyone secured a portal, they would stop fighting immediately and escape the fourth floor without hesitation. After hearing Juno's words, everyone nodded in agreement, but Yizil suddenly noticed something odd about Seong's expression and asked him what was wrong with his face. Seong jumped at the question and quickly denied anything being wrong, insisting that he had always looked this way. Watching the group interact, Lee quietly reflected that after surviving so much together, they had finally learned how to work toward the same goal. For the first time, he felt like they truly functioned as a team, and he resolved to give everything he had. However, that calm thought vanished when he remembered one person who would never accept their plan, Seoyin. Right on cue, Seoyin stood with her arms folded and bluntly demanded to know why she should obey any of them. As she spoke, Seoyin warned them not to try commanding her, threatening to kill them all if they pushed her, and then turned her back and walked away. Behind her, the other players glared with anger, clearly fed up with her attitude, and Lee briefly wondered if it would be better to join forces and eliminate her. 12 hours earlier, Seong had mocked Seoyin, saying this place was no stage for her arrogance, and that without her gun she was nothing but worthless trash. Before anyone could react, she slammed her fist into his face, sending him crashing to the ground. The group froze in shock, stunned both by her sudden attack and by the raw strength she displayed. Standing over him, Seoyin coldly told Seong to stop acting like he had extra lives to waste, finishing her warning by calling him trash to his face. At that very moment, while Seoyin was still berating Seong, Lee stepped in and warned her that she was standing on their ground now and needed to stop causing trouble. As he moved closer to her, Lee reflected on how, back at the start, he had risked everything to eliminate a potential star killer named Junsung. What he never imagined was coming face to face with a true star killer, and worse, one who was deadly even without relying on a gun. While these thoughts raced through his mind, Seoyin calmly remarked that fate had brought them together once more. Lee responded by asking if she had anything important to say, adding that this was hardly the right moment for casual greetings. Before Lee could finish, a sharp sense of danger washed over him, radiating straight from Seoyin. Instinctively, he retreated several steps, and at that exact moment, the system window appeared, announcing that the star killer Seoyin had chosen Lee as her primary target. Staring at the message, Lee felt baffled, unsure of what such a designation truly meant. As he tried to understand, another system panel appeared, displaying a detailed guide, and the contents left him stunned. Meanwhile, Seoyin turned away from the group, her eyes burning with clear irritation and suppressed fury as she walked off. Not long after, Seong was seen locked in combat with an orc. When he finally struck the finishing blow, he strangely apologized to the creature for damaging its handsome face and jokingly told it to turn into his experience points. In its final moments, the confused orc seemed to wonder why another orc-like being was attacking it, before collapsing lifelessly to the ground. The instant the orc collapsed, a glowing portal appeared beside its body, leaving Seong wide-eyed with shock since he had barely defeated a handful of monsters. While he stood there debating what he should do next, Lee suddenly appeared right in front of him, making Seong jump in surprise. Nervously, Seong asked what Lee was doing there, but Lee instead questioned why Seong looked so shaken and whether he had done something suspicious to react that way. Seong at that time was laughing in a panicked manner and tried to deny the situation. He claimed that it was not what Lee thought and added that he had only assumed Lee had already opened a portal. Lee, however, did not believe a single word that Seong was saying and instead concluded that Seong had opened a portal. Seong, on hearing that, thought to himself that Lee was a hateful brat who was also quick-witted. In that moment, as he was thinking about that, Lee cut through his nonsense and immediately kicked Seong into the portal. Lee at that time, after having sent Seong through the portal, told himself that he knew Seong was up to no good. At that moment, Lee thought to himself that he had now taken care of one problem, but there was still another problem. That problem was none other than Seoyin. Lee at that time then remembered what the guide had shown him. The guide had notified Seoyin that the traits of a star killer would be completely unlocked when the Day of the Blood arrived. On the Day of the Blood, if Lee was to be killed by the star killer would obtain a very good reward. Because of that, the system had advised Lee to level up as much as he could in preparation for the Day of the Blood. Lee at that time, on remembering what the system had told him, thought to himself that he did not know when the Day of the Blood would take place. However, there there was a high chance that it would be advantageous for the Star Killer and numerous people would definitely die. Because of that, he needed to do something about it before the Day of the Blood was about to arrive. In that moment, as Lee was thinking about that, a level 10 orc appeared before him. As the orc was about to attack, Lee delivered a powerful slash that killed it immediately. And upon doing so, he thought to himself that he needed to become as strong as possible before the Day of the Blood. After killing the orc, Lee noticed that no portal had opened, and he realized that even if he could kill all the monsters on the floor and had enough time, it would still be impossible since not everyone had escaped yet. Lee also remained wary of Seoyin, who was somewhere killing monsters, and he began to consider how he should approach the situation carefully. As Lee continued walking around in search of monsters, he soon caught the scent of a rotten stench and wondered where it was coming from. At that moment, the system appeared and informed him that while orcs naturally had a stench, those that left behind a portal would smell far worse than the others. Hearing this, Lee felt relieved as he realized he had finally found an orc that would leave behind a portal. Without hesitation, he rushed toward it and delivered a powerful slash that killed the orc in a single strike, and immediately after, a portal appeared. Lee, upon seeing this, smiled at the result. A few moments later, Lee stood in front of Seoyin, and at that moment he put on a composed expression while pretending to be unfortunate and implied that he was unlucky since he had still not found a portal. And Seoyin, looking troubled by his behavior, questioned whether he was truly that unlucky. Lee in that moment, on hearing Seoyin's question, told Seoyin that he had never won anything in life, and that this kind of random luck mission was the worst kind of mission for Lee. Lee in that moment, as he said that, thought to himself that although it was because he was intentionally avoiding the orcs that would open a portal, because Seoyin needed to kill Lee on the Day of the Blood, Seoyin had no choice but to let Lee kill the orcs instead, and if Lee was to die in there without securing a portal, it would be bad for Seoyin too, but Lee had already secured a portal, so he did not need to worry about anything at all. Right at that moment, the system popped up and told Lee that a certain player had opened a portal, and that the remaining escape portals were now only 5, and Lee at that time thought to himself that the situation was great for him, and that the rest of the players seemed to be escaping smoothly. Lee at that moment then acted like he was in trouble and told Seoyin that there were only 5 portals remaining. But as Lee was saying all of that, Seoyin was furious at Lee's behavior and told him to be quiet and focus on finding the portal, and Lee, on seeing her face, got scared, retreated immediately, and agreed with what she said. Time passed by, and Lee was still killing all of the orcs that were not supposed to open a portal, and in that moment, as he was killing the orcs, Lee thought to himself that every time he cut down an orc, he would feel both sorry and pleasantly refreshed. And he also added that his contradictory feelings were like his relationship with Seoyin, and he could not believe in that moment that he was able to see her worried face about him not being able to find a portal to escape. In that moment, Lee turned towards Seoyin and told her that he was the one who had not found a portal yet. So he asked her why she was the one who was looking anxious, and Seoyin, on hearing that, quickly changed her expression and told him that she was not anxious at all about him not finding a portal. Lee at that time told Seoyin that she should tell him already how many portals she had opened, and Seoyin at that time told Lee that she had opened up 5 portals already for herself, and Lee, upon hearing that, thought to himself that she had already opened up a lot of portals for herself, but he also added that it was still within the buffer. Seoyin had 5 portals of her own, and Lee had 1 already, and Lee thought to himself that if he assumed that the remaining 11 people had each opened 1 portal, that would mean that there was still a total of 3 portals left. So Lee at that moment thought that maybe the only ones left on the 4th floor were just the 2 of them now. Lee at that moment then thought to himself that it was time for him to split up with Seoyin, as there were only 10 minutes left. So in that moment, Lee acted shocked and told Seoyin that there were only 10 minutes remaining. So he told her that he would go find a portal on his own, and told Seoyin to go ahead first through her own portal that she had opened. In that moment, as he was about to split from Seoyin, Seoyin suddenly told him to stop, and Lee, upon hearing that, fell into a state of panic as he thought that Seoyin had realized what he was trying to do. Lee at that moment asked Seoyin if she had any more business with him and reminded her at the same time that there were less than 10 minutes left. So he advised her to go to the portal to escape, but in that moment Seoyin said something to Lee in a low tone, and Lee was not able to hear what she was saying. Lee at that moment, on observing Sin's strange behavior, thought to himself that something about her was off, and he added that he needed to get out of there quickly. But in that moment Seoyin suddenly ran up towards him, and Lee at that time drew his sword as he thought that she was about to attack him. But instead Seoyin grabbed onto his clothes and shyly admitted that she had forgotten the locations of the portal she had opened. And Lee, upon hearing that, was surprised by what she had said and realized in that moment that Seoyin had no sense of direction. Moments later, Lee escaped through the portal and managed to regroup with his team. And in that moment Seoyin came running towards Lee with a happy expression and told him that he had finally arrived. But as Seoyin was about to hug him, Lee delivered a powerful punch straight to his face, sending him flying backwards. After landing that punch, Lee told himself that Seoyin had startled him, and he also thought that his mission was not yet complete upon seeing him. Seoyeon then approached Lee and remarked that, thinking about it, Seoyeon resembled an orc, and Lee, upon hearing that, told her that she did not need to say that out loud. In that moment, Yeziel came over and told Seoyeon that she had made it back safely, while Juno expressed his relief and added that even though Seoyeon had been their enemy in the past, she was now their teammate, and Juno further said that he looked forward to working with her from then on, and as he said that, he extended his hand for a handshake, but Seoyeon turned her back on him and told him that he was being very noisy. Seoyeon at that moment, clenching his nose that was dripping with blood after being punched by Lee, told Seoyeon that she was a little wench and added that she should have been trapped on the 4th floor to die. But in that moment, Seoyeon referred to Seoyeon as a pig and told him to shut his mouth, while Seoyeon, furious at that moment, told Seoyeon that it was not fat, but instead muscle. As the two were arguing, Lee wondered if he should have left Seoyeon back on the 4th floor, but he thought to himself that it would not make sense for the Star Killer who was blessed by the system to die for being lost, so he added that he should just take this as a chance to make Seoyeon indebted to him. Although he remembered how Seoyeon had acted towards him when she did not know where her portals were and told himself that he needed to be wary around Seoyeon. Lee at that moment also thought that he did not believe that she would do anything until the Day of the Blood, so it should be fine for the moment, but as Lee was thinking about that, a voice could be heard telling all of the players that everyone seemed to be getting a little used to things now. And in that moment, everyone was surprised on hearing that, as the voice belonged to none other than Kumkum, and Kumkum in that moment was standing proudly. But in that moment, Kumkum's head was suddenly blown away, and it was none other than Seoyeon who had done that with her gun. And in that moment, she asked the rabbit why he was here again. Everyone, on seeing what Seoyeon had done, was shocked beyond belief, as they could not believe that Seoyeon would just shoot Kumkum out of nowhere. However, in that moment, Kumkum appeared immediately in front of Seoyeon and told her that she had quite an intense way of greeting him even though they had not seen each other in a while. And just as it said that, Kumkum delivered a powerful attack towards Seoyeon, which sent her flying backwards. Seoyeon at that moment steadied herself against the wall and was badly injured. And Lee at that moment was surprised that Kumkum was able to send Seoyeon flying so easily. But as Lee thought about it more carefully, he considered that if he had taken Kumkum's stats into account, then maybe it had actually gone easy on Seoyeon. So in that moment, Lee thought to himself that Kumkum had not killed Seoyeon because she was a star killer, and a star killer was important in the tower. Kumkum in that moment told itself that it should calm down a little, as it was still too early for it to knock off work. In that moment, Kumkum let out an evil laugh and told all the players present that it was yet time for them to go to the next mission. Kumkum at that moment then told everyone that before they were to proceed to the next floor, it was going to change the lobby's background. And as a change of background, Lee was surprised to see that Kumkum had transformed the lobby into a library. Kumkum at that moment then told everyone that from then on, all of them were to choose one book each. And with an evil smile, Kumkum told the players that the book would either be a useful one that would help them survive or a useless one that would get them killed, and that it all depended on their decision, so they would make sure to choose their books carefully. Seoyeon at that moment shouted that he would not let a mere book decide his fate, while Juno, on the other hand, was thinking about whether he would become stronger if he were to find a sword technique manual. Kumkum at that moment then added that they were not allowed to reveal the contents of the book to anyone else, and that all the books there would disappear once the 5th mission started. So Kumkum told them that it hoped they would all select a book that they would not regret choosing. And as it said that, it disappeared again. One of the players then became confused, as that was all that Kumkum had to say, while another player told the rest that they should start looking for the book that they would need. As everyone was searching through the books, Lee, on the other hand, was thinking to himself that it looked like everyone was searching in categories related to their classes. And Lee guessed that it was to be expected, as it would just be a waste of time to look for something else in this situation. But in that moment, as he was thinking about that, the guidebook popped up and told Lee to choose the book called SSS Rank Returner's Monopoly of Connections that was present in the novel section. And Lee, upon seeing this, was confused that the guidebook had told him to choose a book that was not related to his class, but instead was suggesting that Lee waste his time on a novel that was not related to him at all. Lee at that time, on looking at the book, was in a state of shock, as upon seeing the title of the book, Lee felt that the title itself already seemed quite useless. But Lee at that moment also thought to himself that, in any case, he was sure that this book was recommended for a reason, so he decided to read it first before coming to a conclusion. As Lee opened the first page of the book, he realized that the book contained a story that was one of those trashy, mass-produced fantasies. In that moment, as Lee looked at the books chosen by Yeziel, Seoyeon, and Juno, he saw that the three of them had chosen incredible books that were granting them impressive and interesting skills. So in that moment, Lee thought to himself that he felt like he had already lost, and that maybe he should have chosen a sword technique or martial arts manual. Right in that moment, as Lee was thinking about this situation, he heard a loud noise behind him that startled him. and Lee at that moment immediately turned around to see who it was, but was surprised and confused to see that it was Secheng, who was looking extremely excited after setting up a tent. So in that moment, Lee wondered what kind of book Secheng had chosen to aid him. But right at that moment, Lee wondered why he was still hearing a banging noise, even though Secheng had already stopped building the tent. And as he looked toward where the actual noise was coming from, Lee was surprised to see Seoyin, who was looking extremely irritated and furious as she repeatedly muttered to herself that she would definitely kill Kumkum the next time she saw the rabbit. And in that moment, there was a rabbit doll lying on the ground, which she was relentlessly beating with a hammer and a nail while holding some kind of book that appeared to be cursed. Lee at that moment, on seeing Seoyin in that state, quietly turned away from her and told himself that he should avoid her for the time being, as he did not want to deal with Seoyin while she was in such a frightening state. Moments later, the system popped up in front of everyone and informed them that the time was up and that they would all be moved to the 5th floor. Right at that moment, all of the adventurers were teleported to a different location, and in that moment the adventurers were surprised to find that they were now dressed in school uniforms and were all sitting in a classroom along with a few other adventurers who appeared to not be moving at all, as if time had stopped there. At that moment, one of the adventurers told the rest that it seemed as though all of them had become younger, and another agreed with what had been said. Secheng at that time was not pleased with the outcome, as all of the muscles that he had worked so hard to build had disappeared, leaving him skinny, while Seong, on the other hand, after seeing how Secheng looked, laughed at him and told him that the soldier had become as thin as an anchovy. Lee at that moment wondered if they had all returned to their student days in order to fit the mission's background. As Lee looked at Seong, he observed that Seong was mostly the same except that he was bald. And then Lee looked at Yiziel and noted that Yiziel looked good even when she was younger. But right at that moment, Lee shifted his gaze to Seoyin and was surprised that she had a completely different aura when she was still a school student. But at that very moment, Seoyin became angry that Lee was looking at her. So she grabbed her spectacles and crushed them, and at the same time asked Lee who he was looking at. Right as Seoyin said that, she immediately turned away from Lee as she became embarrassed upon facing him, while Lee, on the other hand, thought to himself that Seoyin did not look much different from her current self, and that the only difference was that she wore glasses, as she might have had poor eyesight in the past. Right at that moment, an announcement was made to all of the adventurers, asking them if they were treasuring the youth that they had returned to, and everyone at that time, on hearing the voice, immediately knew that it belonged to none other than Kumkum himself. Kumkum at that time then told everyone that the 5th floor mission was role-playing, and added that in this place, it was another dimension where humans and monsters coexisted, and starting from that moment, all of the adventurers were cadets of an academy that trained monster hunters. Kumkum further added that for the next 4 days, quests would appear from time to time, and if they were to fail a quest, they would be sent to a death mission. So Kumkum told them to make sure that they gave it their best effort. At that time, the adventurers were worried that they had to complete the quests, and that if they were to fail even once, they would be sent to the death mission. Lee at that time thought to himself that even though he had managed to survive a death mission before, he believed that it would be extremely difficult for a normal player to survive it. Lee at that time told himself that if he had known that earlier, then he should have chosen a sword technique manual instead of a useless novel. Kumkum at that moment then told everyone that it was time to give them the memories needed for the roleplay. And at that very moment, a multitude of unknown white particles came and entered each and every adventurer. The system at that time then informed everyone that the given memories were now in place. Lee at that time thought to himself that what had happened to him and everyone else was quite fascinating, as it felt like he now had 2 different sets of memories coexisting in his mind. And Lee added that the new memories he had received were the same as the content that he had read in the SSS Rank Returner's Monopoly of Connections. Kumkum at that time then told everyone that after the class ended, the quest would begin, so Kumkum told them to enjoy the present as much as they could. Right at that moment, time unfroze, and the people who had been frozen in place were now able to move again, and the teacher at that time began speaking and started giving his explanation to the students. Juno at that time then whispered to Lee and told him that it looked like the people who had been stopped in time were moving again, while Lee, on the other hand, thought to himself that if they were inside a novel, then he and the rest of the adventurers were merely extras, and he added that the person sitting in front of him would be the protagonist of the novel, whose name was Oyunam, who was also a returner who knew the future. And thanks to the information that Yunam possessed, he was able to monopolize numerous connections with people and places and eventually became the strongest. Right at that moment, the teacher spoke and asked the students if anyone wanted to try answering the question he had, and the teacher added that if any of them were to answer correctly, he would reward them with store points. Lee at that moment then thought to himself that the question was at a level that normal students would never be able to answer, and that originally it was supposed to be answered by Yunam. But in that moment, as Yunam was about to respond, Lee interrupted him and answered the question himself, stating that the answer and the material in question was known as action. Lee then continued and told the teacher that currently Professor Brown's team from Columbia University was conducting research on it, and everyone at that time was surprised to hear that it was Lee who had answered the question. The teacher at that time was impressed, as he had not expected there to be a genius like Lee in the class. The system at that moment then informed Lee that he had obtained store points for answering the question that the teacher had asked, and Lee at that moment smiled as he finally understood why the guide had recommended the novel to him, as all those books about sword techniques and martial arts were not needed for situations like this. And Lee at that time smiled menacingly as he thought to himself that all those connections that Yunam was supposed to obtain would now be taken by him instead. Moments later, they were walking outside of the academy, and Seong at that time, while walking closely beside Lee, asked him how he had been able to answer the question that the teacher had asked, and Lee at that moment told Seong that it was written in the memories that had been given to him. Although Lee at that moment thought to himself that what he was saying was clearly a lie, but he could not reveal the truth to them. Seong at that time, impressed, told Lee that maybe he had inherited a good character, but Lee told Seong to go and ask the tower itself if he was jealous of him. Yizil at that time then interrupted their conversation and asked Lee if he knew when the quest would begin. Lee at that moment thought to himself that based on what he had seen in the novel, it should start around that time. Right at that moment, as Lee was thinking about it, the system popped up in front of everyone and informed them that a quest had appeared, and that their mission was to clear the dungeon that had appeared beside the B-37 building of the Academy, and that their time limit to complete the quest was 60 minutes. And if they were to fail, they would have to participate in the death mission. Lee at that time thought to himself that the item that would drop from the boss monster of the dungeon was extremely important and would play a huge role in the future, and originally Yunam was supposed to obtain that item. But Lee at that moment told himself that there was no way he would simply stand by and let the main character take it. So in that moment, Lee told everyone that they should hurry and complete the mission, and everyone agreed and began running towards the dungeon. Moments later, the system popped up and informed all the adventurers that they had entered the Orc Den dungeon, and Yunam, who was already inside the dungeon, was surprised to see that Lee and the rest had also arrived there. So he asked them how they had known about the place and how they had managed to enter the dungeon. But Lee at that moment quickly ran past Yunam and, with a single slash, defeated the orc monster that stood in front of him, and Lee at that moment addressed Yunam and told him that he was not the only one capable of finding the place. And Yunam at that moment was surprised by what Lee had said. After a few moments, all of the players were fighting against the monsters, and Yunam at that time, while observing them as they fought, thought to himself that the situation was strange, and he did not understand how the people there had been able to find the place, but he had never realized that the cadets in his class were this strong, especially Lee and Seoyin, who were on a completely different level. Yunam at that time then told himself that there was no way he would forget people who were this strong, and he added that at this rate, they might end up taking what was supposed to be his right from under his nose. In that moment, Yunam summoned a spear, and right at that moment he launched it towards the monsters, killing several of the orcs with a single attack, and Lee and Seoyin at that moment were surprised to see Yunam's power. Seong at that moment asked the rest what kind of weapon Yunam was using, and Yizil added that the weapon was incredibly powerful, while Lee at that moment thought to himself that it was as expected of a protagonist, and added that seeing the protagonist in real life made it clear that Yunam was far more overpowered than he had originally thought. And Lee at that moment knew that Yunam would not simply hand over the dungeon rewards so easily. So he told himself that they would see who would be the one to obtain and win the reward of the dungeon. The system at that time then informed the players that the remaining time left was 48 minutes and 20 seconds, and that the remaining number of monsters was 72 out of 100. Lee at that moment then thought to himself that with the momentum they currently had, they would be able to clear the quest without any issues. But Lee also added that if they wanted to obtain the dungeon reward, they would need to kill the most orcs in order to gain the right to challenge the boss monster. Lee at that moment then thought to himself that the current Yunam was definitely stronger than him at the moment. However, Lee added that he was an expert when it came to finding monsters, and Lee at that time started running forward to attack the remaining monsters. But Seoyin at that moment was irritated as she watched Lee getting ahead, and in that moment Seoyin thought to herself that she might have lost to Lee's petty tricks before, but she added that it would not be the same this time around. At that moment, Lee began rapidly killing all of the monsters present in the vicinity, and Seoyin and Yunam joined in the fight and started obliterating the monsters as well. The rest of the players at that time, while observing the three fighting the monsters, remarked that the three of them were incredible, and as they continued watching the battle, Yizil spoke up as she noticed that Lee seemed a bit more desperate than usual, while Juno at that moment, with tears in his eyes as he looked at Lee, told Yizil that Lee was showing them that noble heart of his that did not want to see the rest of the players being sent to the death mission. But Lee at that moment was not thinking about that at all, as he was actually focused on obtaining the dungeon reward. The rest of the players at that time also began to grow teary-eyed, as they believed that Lee was working hard for their sake so that they would not be sent to the death mission, and Juno at that time told the others that Lee was going this far for them. the very ones who had previously voted him into the death mission so that they themselves could survive, so Juno added that he would fully embrace Lee's intentions. In that moment, all of the players were filled with motivation, and Juno at that time told the rest that they would work even harder from then on for Lee's sake, and everyone agreed with what Juno had said, while Lee, on the other hand, upon hearing all of that, was confused about what the rest of the players were doing. Moments later, the system then announced that all the orc monsters had been exterminated and that the boss room had appeared, and all of the players at that time were now standing in front of the boss monster's chamber. The system at that time then informed everyone that the person who had obtained the right to challenge the boss monster was Yunam, and Lee at that moment was surprised to hear the announcement, and in that moment Lee thought to himself that he had done his best, but it was still not enough to surpass Yunam. So Lee at that moment began to wonder what he should do and whether he should simply give up like this. Lee at that moment then thought to himself that at this rate things were not going to work out the way he had planned. So Lee told himself that he was not going to give up that easily, and in that moment he called out to Yunam and told him to give him the rights to challenge the boss monster. And Yunam at that moment was surprised that Lee would say something like that. So he asked Lee what he was suddenly talking about. But Lee at that moment told Yunam that if he wanted to know the way to end the chains of regression, then he should listen, and Yunam at that moment was shocked to hear Lee say that. Yunam at that time then pointed his spear towards Lee and asked him who he really was. But Lee at that moment told Yunam to put his spear away first. Yet Yunam refused and once again demanded that Lee answer how he knew that Yunam was a regressor. Lee at that moment told Yunam that it did not matter how he knew, and instead asked Yunam whether he did not want to see the winter that had occurred when he was 32 years old. And Yunam at that time was visibly shaken upon hearing that. In the past, a man had told Yunam that the starting point of his regression was during November when he was 17 years old. And Yunam had agreed, and the man at that time had told him that he was envious of a life that had been repeatedly lived through the prime years from 17 to 32. And Yunam at that time had told the man that he had always wanted to see the winter that occurred when he was 32 years old, and added that he was tired of the cursed regression that bound him. Back in the present, Lee told Yunam that if he were to allow him to challenge the boss room, then he would reveal how the chains of regression could be broken, and Yunam at that time began to think carefully about what he should do in this situation, while Lee, on the other hand, was taking advantage of the moment, as he knew that Yunam's dream for countless cycles had been to escape the endless curse of regression, and that Yunam had no real choice but to accept his request. Yunam at that time then lowered his spear and warned Lee that if he was merely playing around, then things would become extremely ugly for him. And after saying that, Yunam walked away. Right at that moment, the system appeared and informed everyone that Yunam had given Lee the right to challenge the boss room. Right at that moment, Lee entered the boss room, and the system informed both Lee and the rest of the players that he had done so. Lee at that moment thought to himself that he had somehow managed to enter the boss room and was now standing face to face with the boss monster. But as Lee looked at the monster, he was taken aback, as the boss standing before him looked incredibly difficult to defeat, and Lee at that moment began to feel a slight sense of fear. Lee at that moment then told himself that he needed to remain calm, and added that since he was inside a novel, he did not have clear information about the boss monster's level or guidance from the system. But he reassured himself that he already knew how to defeat it. Lee at that moment then thought to himself that the first strategy he needed to use was to activate one of his skills called Impeccable Senses, and right as he activated it, the monster used one of its own skills called Orc's Warrior Roar, which when activated, caused most opponents facing it to lose their will to fight due to the overwhelming sound. But Lee, having activated Impeccable Senses, not only enhanced his perception, but also allowed him to completely block out the effects of the roar. And at that moment, Lee opened his eyes and declared that a mind attack based on sound would not work on someone like him. And immediately after that, Lee charged straight towards the monster. Lee at that time then moved on to his second strategy to deal with the orc boss monster. And in that moment, Lee thought to himself that although the boss monster's upper body was as hard as steel, its lower body was significantly weaker in comparison. And right at that moment, as the boss monster attempted to attack him, Lee swiftly dodged the strike and unleashed a rapid barrage of attacks aimed at the monster's lower body, targeting all of its vital points. And within seconds, the boss monster was no longer able to stand on its feet and collapsed on the ground, unable to move. And upon achieving that, Lee immediately lunged towards the boss monster and declared that the reward for defeating it would belong to him from that moment onward. Seconds later, the system announced that the orc warrior had dropped an item and that Lee had successfully completed the boss room. Moments later, all of the players had returned to the academy after finishing the quest, and Lee and Seong could be seen playing a game of rock, paper, scissors while betting with the gold coins they had earned. Seong at that time was becoming increasingly furious, as he had just lost to Lee once again, marking his 11th consecutive loss. So Seong asked Lee whether he was cheating, but Lee, on the other hand, told Seong that it was impossible to cheat in a game like that, and added that Seong should stop being unreasonable and simply hand over the gold coins they had wagered. Seong at that time, although filled with regret, had no choice but to accept what Lee had said, while Juno, on the other hand, told Lee that he was incredible, as he was even skilled at a game like rock, paper, scissors. Lee at that time then thought to himself that there were only two mythical items that appeared in the novel, one of which was called Gungnir, which was Oh Yunam's weapon, an overpowered item that would always strike the target it was aimed at, and the other item was the Ring of Nick, which Lee was currently wearing. The ring was of mythical grade and possessed the ability to greatly increase the user's luck, and it was an item that could not be shared with others. Lee at that moment, while looking at the ring he was wearing, thought to himself that although its ability seemed simple, it was still an overpowered item that was just as valuable as Gungnir. And Lee added that this item would serve as a very reliable safeguard during the many turning points to come. Lee then thought to himself that Yunam would have to continue progressing without the ring, but Lee intended to provide Yunam with the information he would need, as there was only one thing that Yunam truly desired in the novel. As Lee was thinking about that, Seoyin approached with an angry expression, interrupted him, and told Lee to play the game against her next. Seoyin at that time then thought to herself that the game was not purely based on luck, but also involved a clash of agility, and since she had close to 50 agility stats, she was confident that she would be able to defeat Lee. Lee at that moment then asked Seoyin how much she was willing to bet, and Seoyin told Lee that the bet would be for 3,000 gold, and Seoyin at that moment, upon hearing that, was surprised that the bet was for such a large amount. But Lee, on the other hand, had different plans, and with a serious expression, he told Seoyin that they should each bet 5,000 gold instead. And after a few moments, Seoyin was left staring at the ground in disappointment, as she had just lost to Lee in the game and had also lost 5,000 gold at the same time. The next day, all of the students were standing in a line outside the academy, and Lee at that moment thought to himself that the time had finally come, the cliché scene that often appeared in novels like this, the evaluation of strength through striking a measuring device. The teacher at that time then told the students that they were to use their own weapons to attack the crystal placed in front of them, and by doing so, their magical power will be displayed in numerical values. The teacher then added that these points would be used when forming their dungeon practice groups 2 days later. Juno at that time told everyone that this was great, as he was curious about how strong the cadets there actually were. Right at that moment, one of the cadets was called forward to strike the crystal, and upon doing so, he received a score of 43 points, and most of the cadets at that time were impressed with the result and praised him for achieving such a score. Juno at that time told Lee that, judging from the reactions of the other cadets, that number seemed to be quite high, and Lee added that based on the injected memories, he remembered that cadet as someone who was fairly strong. The teacher at that moment then called out the next cadet for the test, and it was Juno's turn. Juno, with a confident attitude, stepped forward and delivered a powerful attack, which earned him a total of 69 points, and the rest of the cadets were surprised to see such a high score, as they had not realized that Juno was that strong. And Juno at that time, upon hearing himself being praised, confidently remarked that he had expected himself to be quite strong. Right as Juno had finished with his assessment, Seong stepped in and told Juno to move aside, as it was now his turn. And Seong added that when it came to punching machines, he was the best at it. And right at that moment, Seong delivered a powerful strike towards the crystal, which resulted in a total score of 75 points, and the cadets at that time were even more impressed with Seong, as he had achieved such a high score without using any weapons, relying only on his bare hands. But at that very moment, as Seong was still taking in the compliments from the other students, a bullet suddenly flew past him and struck the crystal, producing a score of 98 points, and the attack came from none other than Seoyin herself, and the cadets at that time did not know how to react anymore, as they already could not believe that a score as high as 98 was possible. And on top of that, Seoyin had infused mana into her gun before firing at the crystal, something they did not even know could be done. Lee at that time, while observing the reactions of the cadets, thought to himself that he felt proud seeing that his teammates were much stronger than the Academy's cadets. But right at that moment, just as Seoyin had finished, another attack landed, achieving a score of 115 points, and it was none other than Yunam. And Lee at that time, upon seeing that, realized that while his teammates were stronger than most of the Academy cadets, they were still below the level of the protagonist. And in that moment, all of the cadets began praising Yunam for achieving such an overwhelming score. Moments later, the students had finished the assessment, and as they were having lunch, Seong, with his mouth full of food, asked Lee why he had not tried to get a better result in the assessment. And Lee at that time told Seong that there was no point in doing so, as they would not receive any rewards from it. Yiziel at that moment addressed Seong and told him that it was impressive that his speech was still quite clear even while talking with food in his mouth, while Juno, upon hearing what Lee had said, told him that he was starting to see him in a new light. Lee at that moment, while eating his food, thought to himself that he could not afford to have a high score, as he needed to be placed in the same dungeon practice group as Oh Yunam, and Lee added that he could not risk obtaining a score that would make him one of the group leaders. Right at that moment, as Lee was thinking about that, the system popped up and informed everyone that the second quest had started, and that their mission was to rescue Oyunam, with a time limit of 1 hour and a location specified as River Garden. Everyone at that moment was surprised upon hearing the details of the second quest, and Yiziel at that moment asked the others whether Yunam was the same strong cadet they had seen in the dungeon the previous day, and Juno at that time confirmed that she was right, and wondered what could have happened to Yunam and whether he had fallen into some kind of trap. Right at that moment, as they were discussing the second quest, Lee was thinking to himself that he already had a general idea of the situation after having read the novel, and added that after Yunam had regressed, he had taught a few thugs within the academy a lesson. But one of those thugs was the only son of Park Yongsik, who was the guild leader of Red Moon, one of the top 10 guilds. And Park Yongsik had then ordered his high-ranking hunters, his direct subordinates, to beat Oyunam, until he was half dead. Lee remembered from the novel that Yunam had survived that situation due to luck, as he had been rescued by someone. But Lee at that moment thought to himself that this had only been possible because Yunam had possessed the ring of Nick at that time, whereas now the situation had changed since the ring was currently with Lee. Yiziel at that time told Lee that if the situation was serious enough for Yunam to be in danger, then it was likely to be extremely dangerous, and Lee agreed with what Yiziel had said and told her that they needed to be prepared, as their opponents would not be easy to defeat through normal means. Lee at that moment, while heading in the direction where Yunam was along with his teammates, thought to himself that no matter how strong Yunam was at that point, he was still only an academy cadet, so they needed to rescue him at all costs. In a different location, Yunam was being beaten by several men, and one of the men at that time told Yunam that he was nothing more than a pest, and that he should never dare to mess with their young master. But right as he said that, the man was suddenly sent flying backwards by one of Seoyun's attacks, and Lee at that moment was surprised by what Seoyun had just done. So he asked her what she was doing all of a sudden, but at that moment, Seoyun charged forward towards the men and told Lee that although he did not like Yunam, he did like people who had no backing, and upon saying that, he began attacking the enemies. And Lee tried to stop them but failed, leaving him with no choice but to join the fight, while the rest of the team followed along as well. The men in black suits at that time were surprised by the sudden appearance of Lee and the others, and one of them expressed shock at having been attacked by a gun, while another wondered whether the ones who had attacked them were academy cadets. Right at that moment, the man who had been struck by Seoyun's bullets stood up and shouted that the academy cadets were arrogant brats. Lee at that moment, while looking at Seoyun, thought to himself that although it had appeared as if she had fired recklessly, her timing had been impeccable, and as he considered that, his gaze shifted toward the enemies in front of him, and he noticed that there were 3 opponents whose abilities far surpassed theirs, making it clear that the only way to create an opening would be through a surprise attack, which was exactly what Seoyun had done, and Lee at that moment realized that Yunam would likely take advantage of that opening. And just as Lee had anticipated, Yunam summoned his weapon and immediately launched an attack against the 3 enemies, although they managed to evade his strikes. Yunam at that time then told Lee that he did not understand how Lee and the others kept appearing in front of him, but added that it was not the time to discuss such matters, and Lee responded by telling Yunam to save his thanks for later and focus on resolving the situation at hand first. Right at that moment, Seoyun launched himself toward one of the enemies who had blue hair, and as he prepared his attack, Seoyun remarked that the man seemed to be the weakest among them, and in that moment Seoyun delivered a powerful strike toward him, but the man immediately activated his abilities, which sent Seoyun flying backwards, and everyone at that moment was shocked upon witnessing the man's power, while the man himself, now furious, addressed them as impudent brats and declared that he would destroy them all. At that moment, the man with blue hair laughed and told Lee and the rest that since they had only been exposed to the world within the academy, it was only natural that they would not understand how terrifying the real world could be, and upon saying that, the 3 enemies charged forward to attack Lee and the others. As the 2 sides clashed in battle, Lee at that moment, while fighting, told Seoyun that while they would buy time on the front line, he wanted her to protect them as much as possible from the rear, and Seoyun, upon hearing that, responded angrily and questioned who he thought he was to be giving such orders. Lee at that moment then commanded the rest that the injured students were to retreat to the rear and receive healing from Yiziel before returning to the front line. And as Yiziel began healing those who were wounded, Yunam was surprised to find that all his injuries had been completely restored, as he had not expected there to be a cadet capable of such advanced healing abilities. Lee, while continuing to fight one of the men, told the rest of the team that although the enemies were incredibly strong, there was no way they would be given a quest that could not be cleared, and he added that it was time for them to make use of the skills they had obtained from books. Yunam swung his sword and clashed against one of the men. Seoyun clenched his fists and unleashed his skill, known as the first punch of the Fist King against an opponent, while Sechang, on the other hand, was seen frantically building a tent while panicking over what to do in the situation. The man with blue hair wondered what they meant by quest books and remarked that if they had time to spout such nonsense, then they must be underestimating the three of them. And at that moment, Lee noticed something as the blue-haired man raised his weapon, with the other two doing the same in preparation for another attack. A sudden spark of light appeared in the distance, followed by a massive explosion that filled the area with smoke. And as the smoke cleared, Lee and the others were still standing, though injured, with Lee panting heavily as he acknowledged that the enemies were indeed powerful. And recalling their past struggles, he thought that after overcoming previous missions together, they had become a united team that would not be easily defeated. But as he looked at the three men in front of them, he realized that the coordination and experience the three enemies possessed as a unit were on an entirely different level compared to his team. Lee, thinking about what to do next, noted that although the three men fought in a tightly coordinated formation, if they could somehow defeat even one of them, the formation would collapse. But he also admitted that he could not see any clear opportunity to achieve that, and he described the situation as if he were facing an iron door with no visible opening. Yahello at that moment spoke up and told everyone to hold on as she continued healing them, adding that she would support all of them, while one of the three men with black hair remarked that the students were surprisingly persistent for a group of brats and added that the hunters in their country seemed to have a promising future ahead. The silver-haired man added that this was not the time to relax and warned that if things continued like this, the situation could become dangerous for them as well, while the blue-haired man, looking enraged with red eyes burning with fury, leapt into the air and complained that this had become a complete nuisance, and then charged straight toward Yahello, declaring that he would start with her, and Yahello was caught off guard. While Lee immediately called out to her, and at that very moment, Yunam raised his weapon and hurled it toward the blue-haired man while telling him to stop, and the attack struck him, leaving the man shocked that it had connected as he had believed he had dodged it, and the blue-haired man landed on the ground and cursed at Yunam, while the black-haired man told him not to act rashly. Lee at that moment realized that the formation of the three men had been broken, and noted that the seemingly indomitable iron wall now had an opening, while the blue-haired man, now gripping a club lined with spikes, declared that since it had come to this, he would kill all of the students. The other two men also began moving forward, stating that it could not be helped, while Lee observed that he could sense the growing anxiety among the three, and added that they were becoming impatient because they had been delayed far longer than they had expected, and Lee, with a faint smile, noted that he already knew the reason behind their impatience. The two men then charged toward the students as well, and all three attacked simultaneously. But at that moment, Lee spoke up and addressed them, asking whether they were truly fine with this situation, and added that their chairman would likely already be furious by now. The three men, upon hearing that, were visibly surprised, and the blue-haired man, now even more irritated, demanded to know what Lee was talking about. Lee smiled to himself and asked them whether their chairman was not known for being extremely impatient, and then mentioned the name of their chairman, Park Yongsik of the Red Moon. The blue-haired man was visibly surprised, and the other two demanded to know how Lee knew about that. And in that moment, the metaphorical iron door seemed to open even wider, as Lee smiled and added that countless people had died after getting on the chairman's nerves, while asking them whether that was not the truth, and the three men fell silent, fully aware that what Lee was saying was correct. In that moment, Lee, Seoyin, and Yunam all realized that it was the perfect opportunity to take advantage of the situation, and Yunam wasted no time as he thrust his weapon into the blue-haired man without hesitation, while Seoyin followed up by firing multiple shots at him, and Lee also raised his weapon and thought to himself that they only needed to focus their attacks on one of the three, and acting on that thought, he struck the blue-haired man cleanly through the middle, causing blood to spray. In that moment, the blue-haired man collapsed onto the ground, defeated, and the remaining two were shocked by what had just happened, while the students quickly shifted their attention toward the remaining enemies, and the black-haired man suddenly burst into loud laughter and told his companion that they should stop there. Lee and Yunam remained ready to continue the fight, but the two men lowered their weapons and walked over to their fallen comrade, helping him up, and one of them remarked that their chairman would probably still punish them if they returned like that, but added that after witnessing the hunters who would represent the future of Korea, they had no regrets. As the two supported their injured ally, the silver-haired man commented that the black-haired one was acting on his own whims again, and the three of them then wished the students good luck before disappearing from sight. The system then appeared and informed everyone that the quest had been cleared, and the students immediately began shouting in celebration, declaring that they had succeeded. Lee, wiping the sweat from his face, thought to himself that it had been a close call, as there had been only 2 minutes remaining. Yunam then spoke and asked Lee whether he had known what was going to happen that day, and Lee, surprised by the question, responded that since they had saved Yunam, he should be thanking them first, and Yunam, somewhat shyly, offered a quiet expression of gratitude, which Lee pretended not to hear, prompting Yunam to thank them again more clearly. Lee then smiled gently and thought to himself that for Yunam, This must be the regression with the most changes he had experienced so far, and as Yunam expressed his thanks once more with a hint of irritation, Lee began to walk away and told him to be careful in the future, adding that this regression would be more difficult than any he had faced before. Yunam, confused, called out and said he had one more question, asking whether Lee was also a regressor, and Lee simply smiled and replied that he was not, as the wind rustled through the trees, and Lee added that he was something even greater than that before continuing to walk away. Yunam, shocked by those words, quickly grabbed Lee by the shoulders and angrily asked where he was going, pointing out that Lee had forgotten to tell him something important, namely the method to escape the curse of regression, and Lee casually responded that he had completely forgotten about that. The next day, back at the academy, the teacher was seen informing the students that he would be announcing the groupings for the following day's dungeon practical, and as he continued making the announcements, Lee, on the other hand, was focused on something else entirely, and then suddenly laughed to himself in satisfaction, adding that Yunam really knew how to handle things properly, as he was currently looking at the item he had obtained. The system displayed that the item was the armor of Thea and that it was of rare grade. Thinking back to their earlier interaction, Lee thought to himself that perhaps Yunam, being the protagonist, made him more capable of accepting realities that were otherwise difficult to believe. In that moment, the teacher announced that the leader of Group 4 was Oh Yunam, and then proceeded to list the group members as Wu Jiho, Shin Sungnium, Go Yongwoo, and Lee Hoyoung. Lee, smiling to himself, thought that everything had gone exactly as he had planned, and silently thanked the Ring of Nick. Lee then reflected that in order to obtain the best possible reward, he had managed to get himself into Yunam's group. But he also added that this was not the time to celebrate yet, as there was still something that needed to be done. Moments later, Yunam was seen having a conversation with Lee, and Yunam stated that Lee must already know that the dungeon in their practical would go berserk, and upon hearing that, Lee chose not to respond, while Yunam continued, explaining that although dungeon berserk phenomena did occasionally occur, it made no sense for them to happen simultaneously. Yunam added that he had struggled through every regression, yet he had never been able to uncover the cause behind it. Yunam then looked at Lee seriously and told him that he hoped Lee would share any information he might have, adding that if Lee's existence was truly something greater than a regressor, then he must know something, yet Lee still remained silent. Based on the novel's development, 3 groups, including Group 4, would experience a dungeon berserk, and in that incident, the only group that managed to avoid being wiped out was Group 4, the one that had Yunam in it, but the details of the berserk, such as its cause, were never mentioned in the novel. Lee at that moment finally spoke up and apologized to Yunam, but added that not even he knew everything. Yunam then grabbed Lee by the collar and shouted that even if what was supposed to happen would still happen, Lee should at least try to do something, and Lee, raising his voice as well, insisted that he truly did not know anything, while thinking to himself that the author had never given any hints throughout the novel and had ended that part vaguely, leaving him with no answers to rely on. As the two continued shouting, Seoyeon, who happened to be nearby, heard their voices and approached, and in that moment she suddenly appeared from around the corner and asked what the two of them were doing, and the scene took on an oddly romantic atmosphere, with a bright pink background as the two men were grabbing each other by the collar in a way that looked like something straight out of a romance novel. Seoyeon was left speechless, and the two men were equally unsure of how to respond, and Seoyeon then turned and walked away, saying that it seemed like she had gotten lost again, while the two of them panicked and called out to her to wait, insisting that it was not what it looked like. Moments later, Yunam and his team stood before the dungeon entrance as their instructor signaled that Group 4's turn had come, prompting them to step inside, while the system declared their mission to clear the assigned dungeon for their practical. Lee was seen letting out a quiet sigh, recalling the earlier moment when Seoyeon had looked at him with clear disgust and kept her distance, leaving him burdened not only with the unresolved dungeon berserk incident, but also with that lingering misunderstanding. Just then, Yunam halted and instructed the team to split up and scout the area, making it clear that they should use their radios if anything went wrong, and the group agreed without hesitation, though Lee remained distracted by his thoughts. As he moved forward alone, Lee began analyzing the situation, noting that the groups tied to the berserk incident were Groups 4, 9, and 12, with his own team making up Group 4, Yiziel and Seoyeon in Group 9, and Seoyeon leading Group 12. He reasoned that Group 9 would likely be safe since Yiziel possessed healing abilities and the so-called Killer Star blessed by the tower would not fall so easily on the 5th floor, leaving Group 12 under Seoyeon as the more uncertain factor, which led Lee to quietly wish him well. Suddenly, the sound of approaching footsteps broke his train of thought, forcing Lee to open his eyes as monsters emerged before him, catching him off guard. Yet he quickly steadied himself, raising his sword and sharpening his focus as he prepared to deal with the immediate danger. As Lee reached that conclusion, a lingering issue surfaced in his mind, and it took shape in the form of Go Yongwoo, who was cowering behind him, trembling in fear. Yongwoo, an Explorer-class player and the youngest within Hoyang's area, struggled to steady himself as tears streamed down his face, offering repeated apologies while Lee looked on in quiet confusion, unsure what had driven him to such a state. Not long after, the monsters surrounding them were dealt with, their bodies scattered across the ground. Yet Yongwoo remained shaken, still crying as Lee turned his attention to calming him down. With a thoughtful expression, Lee brought up the past incident when the group had voted him out, wondering if Yongwoo was still burdened by that moment. And Yongwoo admitted that ever since then, he had lacked the courage to face Lee, regretting deeply that he had not spoken up sooner. His emotions surged once more, leading him to break down again as he continued apologizing, his guilt refusing to fade. Watching this, Lee realized just how soft-hearted Yongwoo truly was, and with a gentle gesture, he placed his hands on Yongwoo's shoulders, reassuring him that there was no need for regret, and even insisted that if faced with the same situation again, Yongwoo should make the exact same choice, which left him visibly surprised. Lee reflected on the harsh reality they lived in, emphasizing through his tone that the dangers they faced were real and unforgiving, especially within the tower where death could come at any moment, making it impossible for someone with such a fragile heart to endure. He conveyed that survival here demanded the ability to prioritize oneself above all else. And as his stern expression softened into a calm smile, he lightly patted Yongwoo's head, signaling that there was no need to carry guilt any longer. Though tears still lingered, Yongwoo managed a faint smile, his admiration for Lee becoming clear in that quiet moment. Caught off guard by Yongwoo's words, Lee grew slightly embarrassed and brushed it off, claiming he did not understand what Yongwoo meant, while Yongwoo gazed at him with clear admiration. Convinced of his own thoughts, Yongwoo expressed that Lee must have been someone remarkable even before everything had changed, which caused Lee to reflect inwardly on what his life had truly been like before the end. He remembered growing up in an orphanage, enduring constant discrimination and struggling to survive day by day, pushing through life so desperately that before he realized it, he had already reached his late 20s. In truth, he had been nothing more than an ordinary office worker barely managing to get by, and the only reason he had become somewhat exceptional within the tower was due to a mere coincidence, something that, without happening, might have left him unable to survive until now. Thinking about it, Lee questioned what right he had to guide anyone at all. Just then, Yongwoo called out to him, curious about what had occupied his thoughts so deeply, and Lee dismissed it as nothing significant. Even so, Yongwoo thanked him once again, pointing out that despite advising others to prioritize their own survival, Lee himself had repeatedly risked his life to protect those around him. With a small but sincere smile, Yongwoo shared his desire to become someone like Lee, someone capable of helping others, which took Lee by surprise before a quiet smile formed on his face. In that moment, he realized that what truly mattered was not the past, but what lay ahead, because the path they walked only moved forward, and with that understanding, the two continued on together, Lee lightly patting Yongwoo's head as they advanced. Moments later, Yongwoo was seen placing his hands against the wall, sensing something unusual, and when Lee asked if this was the source of the strange energy, Yongwoo confirmed it, explaining that something seemed to be leaking from within. Lee focused carefully, yet even with his sharpened senses, he could detect nothing, leading him to conclude that if it required an adventurer's specialized search ability, then it made sense he could not perceive it. Deciding to act, Lee told Yongwoo to step aside before drawing his sword, channeling his level 3 basic swordsmanship as a surge of purple light sparked upon impact, followed by a blinding flash that forced the wall to split open. As the hidden passage revealed itself, the system notified them that they had entered a labyrinth, a revelation that caught both of them off guard. Lee's thoughts raced as he realized that no such labyrinth had ever appeared in the original story, nor in any of the countless regressions experienced by Yunam, where not even a single mention of such a place existed. This led him to a single unsettling conclusion, that this space was never created by the author and could potentially hold answers behind the Dungeon Berserk incident. Moving forward cautiously, the two advanced deeper until they suddenly halted, spotting a figure standing ahead, its presence unnatural and unfamiliar. The being addressed them as humans and questioned how they had arrived, prompting Lee to react with surprise as the system displayed its information, revealing a creature named Jamba Jamba, a level 134 fairy. The creature expressed irritation at their presence, and to Lee's growing concern, it was not alone, as several of these beings stood before them, leaving him wondering just what kind of entities they were facing. Another member of the fairy race, Kum, a level 133 entity, stepped forward and urged Jamba Jamba to pause, pointing out that Lee and Yongwoo were not characters within the story, which immediately startled Jamba Jamba. And Kum went on to emphasize that the taller one, gesturing directly at Lee, had already caused a significant shift in the narrative, even revealing decisive spoilers to Yunam. This claim drew everyone's attention toward Lee as Jamba Jamba addressed him directly, insisting that a conversation was necessary, while the rest of the fairies fixed him with piercing glares that left Lee visibly shaken. Surrounded on all sides by the tiny yet overwhelming beings, Lee found himself frozen, uncertain of how to react, as Jamba Jamba demanded to know his identity. At the same time, Lee awkwardly covered himself, distracted by the uncomfortable feeling of being scrutinized so closely, before hesitantly explaining that he was someone who had read about this world. Another fairy questioned how he had arrived so suddenly, appearing the moment he opened his eyes, and Lee confirmed that it was something along those lines. As the fairies continued murmuring among themselves, Lee cautiously asked who they were, prompting them to reveal that they were fairy repairmen responsible for fixing the countless inconsistencies within flawed stories like this one. Meanwhile, Jamba Jamba noticed that his hammer had gone missing, appearing confused as Lee began piecing together their nature, while Jamba Jamba continued searching in disbelief. After a brief pause, Lee spoke up, acknowledging that their work must be difficult given how many errors there were to fix, and this unexpected recognition deeply moved the fairies, bringing some of them to tears as they expressed how rare it was for anyone to understand their efforts, with one even noting that the story's flaws affected Lee just as much as it did them. Lee readily agreed, admitting that finishing the novel had been an exhausting ordeal, and as Jamba Jamba wiped away his tears, he remarked that although he had initially intended to bury Lee underground, he would instead erase his memories and let him go, a statement that immediately filled Lee with dread as he wondered how such a terrifying decision could be delivered so casually. Realizing the danger, Lee quickly understood that he could not allow that to happen, reasoning that losing his memories would render everything he had done to reach this labyrinth meaningless. As Jamba Jamba extended his hand toward him, Lee reacted urgently, revealing that the berserk event on the third floor was the very flaw about to unfold, and questioned whether they had yet found a way to fix it, which stunned the fairies and prompted them to demand how he knew such a thing. Internally, Lee reflected that even a flawed story could still teach valuable details, and with renewed confidence, he proposed that he might be able to provide them with a solution, causing visible surprise among the fairies. Moments later, both Lee and Yongwu were abruptly expelled from the dungeon as a portal sealed behind them, leaving Yongwu relieved while Lee remained frozen in shock, unable to process what had just happened. And even when Yongwu checked on him, wondering if he had been harmed, Lee could not respond properly. Rewinding to just before that moment, Lee had presented his idea after gaining their attention, prompting Jamba Jamba to consider that ignoring the issue would inevitably create the largest inconsistency in the story so far, one that would damage their reputation as fairy mechanics, leading him to agree to hear Lee out. Seizing the opportunity, Lee raised 3 fingers and proposed that the 3 dungeons destined to go berserk should be merged into one through a portal, triggering all events simultaneously as a way to resolve the looming flaw. Kum considered the idea and pointed out that merging 3 dungeons into one would make the situation appear far more natural compared to having multiple berserk incidents occur simultaneously without explanation. And Jamba Jamba found the reasoning convincing, but raised a concern that an increase in dungeon scale would inevitably require a greater reward upon completion. This caught Lee off guard, while Kum agreed that such a consequence was unavoidable, even for them, as it was something beyond their control. Realizing the issue, Lee understood that the fairy repairmen were worried about disrupting the balance of the story if Yunam ended up receiving rewards far beyond what was originally intended. Tightening his fist, Lee stepped forward with a bold suggestion, proposing that the reward be given to him instead, which immediately surprised Jamba Jamba and led the fairies into a heated discussion among themselves. As they debated, Lee reflected that the decision was now out of his hands, leaving the outcome to chance and to Nick, but the tension quickly returned when Jamba Jamba concluded that erasing Lee's memories would still be the safest option. Shocked, Lee tried to resist as Jamba Jamba reached out once more, explaining that if someone insignificant like Lee managed to achieve too much, it would create complications for them as well. Yet despite his efforts, Lee found himself powerless to stop it, cursing Nick just before his memories were taken away and everything went blank. Returning to the present, Yongwu was frantically trying to snap him out of it, shaking him and even slapping him in panic before pulling out his hammer with the intent to knock him back to his senses, worried about what those strange beings had done to him. But just as he was about to strike, Lee finally responded, assuring him that he was fine. Yongwu's expression immediately brightened with relief at seeing him recover, while Lee himself remained quietly shaken, still struggling to process what had just occurred. After a short while, the two continued walking, and Yongwu apologized, admitting he had feared that Lee had truly lost his memories, while he quietly reflected on just how strong those frantic slaps had been. As he gathered his thoughts, Lee realized how fortunate they were that the fifth floor mission had a time limit, since there would be no need to erase the memories of someone who would soon leave anyway. His mind briefly drifted back to the earlier moment when Jamba Jamba had been about to erase his memories, only for Lee to stop him by pointing out that he would be gone by the next day, which had caused Jamba Jamba to hesitate and ultimately abandon the attempt. Returning to the present, Yeonwoo cautiously wondered if Lee was upset, but Lee's attention shifted instead to the hammer Yeonwoo was holding, prompting him to ask about it. Yeonwoo explained that when the dwarves had taken him away and vanished, they had dropped the hammer, and he had simply picked it up without thinking much of it. As the system displayed its details, Lee learned that it was the Fairy Mechanic's hammer, a unique grade item capable of repairing damaged equipment and increasing the success rate of enhancements, which left him genuinely surprised by its value. A faint smile formed on Lee's face as he realized that Yeonwoo was not as weak or fragile as he had initially seemed. Collecting himself, Lee reflected on the secret agreement he had made with the fairies, which had resulted in a mission exclusive to him, and just then the system appeared again, informing him of a hidden objective that required him to restore the plausibility of the novel's world by quietly achieving the highest contribution within the dungeon, while the reward remained undisclosed. Lee went on to explain that in order to avoid becoming an anomaly within the storyline, he had to achieve his results discreetly, as that was the condition tied to the mission, and if he succeeded, a special reward would await him. At that very moment, the ground began to tremble violently, catching both of them off guard, and Lee immediately realized that it had finally begun. The system appeared soon after, announcing that due to an unknown energy, the dungeon had entered a berserk state, causing stronger monsters to emerge and merging 3 separate dungeons into one. Yeonwoo was visibly shaken by the sudden turn of events, unable to understand what was happening or why the dungeons had fused together, while Lee remained still, calmly processing the situation. After a brief pause, Lee stepped forward and urged Yeonwoo to stay focused, directing him to head northeast in order to locate Yunam, explaining that with his search abilities, he should be able to avoid the most dangerous threats and reach him safely. As he considered this, Lee acknowledged to himself that Yeonwoo was far more capable than he appeared, and that as long as he was with Yunam, there would be little to worry about. Yeonwoo then asked what Lee intended to do, and in response, Lee gave a faint smile before his expression turned serious as he looked ahead, deciding that he would move forward with his own plan. In another part of the dungeon, a massive scorpion loomed over a group of students as chaos unfolded, one of them panicking as he questioned why the creatures had suddenly begun spewing poison, while another realized that the berserk state had triggered their aggression. Amid the turmoil, Yeziel moved swiftly, healing the injured as one of the students expressed deep relief at being saved just in time, only for Yeziel to immediately sense danger and warn him of the threat behind him. The student turned in fear as the attack nearly struck, but before it could land, the monster's head was suddenly gone, its body collapsing lifelessly, leaving him frozen in shock as a cold voice cut through the tension, questioning whether they were treating the situation like a picnic. Seoyin stood there with her gun in hand, her expression filled with irritation as she forced them to snap back to their senses before they met a grim fate. Elsewhere, Lee was moving rapidly through the dungeon, cutting down monsters in his path as he wondered if this was the same area occupied by Soyin's group, recognizing that while her weapon gave her an advantage against poison-type enemies, the danger still posed a serious threat to the other cadets. Despite that, he knew he could not intervene openly due to the conditions placed on him, leaving him with no option but to proceed alone and clear the dungeon as quickly as possible. Suddenly, a colossal scorpion let out a deafening screech, its cries signaling the onset of a catastrophe. Not long after, Lee advanced calmly through a field of fallen monsters, the air thick with a toxic stench that led him to his destination. And as he stopped, he prepared himself for the entity before him. The creature, known as the Scorpion King, faced him head-on and unleashed a surge of poison, which Lee narrowly avoided before landing and assessing the situation, realizing just how much venom had filled the area and acknowledging that closing the distance would not be easy. Lee reasoned that Yunam would somehow handle the situation with Group 4, but the remaining 2 dungeons still required his intervention, and although part of him acknowledged that his actions might be driven by the goal of securing the top position, he could not stand by and allow tragedies like those he had witnessed before to unfold again. As that memory lingered, the Scorpion King launched another barrage of poison, which Lee skillfully evaded while advancing, only for the creature to follow up with a vicious slash that he avoided by leaping upward, yet the next strike came too quickly, catching him off guard and sending him crashing into a wall as blood spilled from his mouth. The monster seemed almost amused by his struggle, which only fueled Lee's frustration as he forced himself back up, realizing that he needed a way to close the distance. Landing firmly, Lee considered his options and reluctantly concluded that he had no choice but to use a trump card he had hoped to save, deciding that this was no time for hesitation as he charged forward once more. In that instant, a memory surfaced of a subquest he had completed for his professor, where he had successfully kept a bucket filled to the brim without spilling a drop, earning him the reward known as Perfect Shield. As the Scorpion King unleashed another wave of poison, Lee activated the skill, rendering the attack completely ineffective and allowing him to push through unharmed, recognizing it as a powerful ability that could block any attack once. The creature reacted in surprise and attempted another strike, but Lee moved decisively, unleashing a level 3 basic swordsmanship technique that sliced cleanly through the monster, cutting it in half and bringing the battle to an end. The system appeared to confirm that he had defeated the boss, and without delay, Lee stepped through the portal that followed, already thinking ahead as the system announced his progress. Moving forward, he reflected that the only dungeon left was the one Seong had entered, and for a brief moment, he found himself wondering if Seong was safe, which caught him off guard. Startled by his own concern, Lee quickly tried to dismiss the feeling, reminding himself of the poor impression he initially had, yet his reaction betrayed a subtle shift as he grew flustered, insisting that it was nothing more than the natural vigilance one might feel toward a potential rival rather than genuine worry. Lee lifted his gaze and scanned his surroundings, puzzled by the complete emptiness of the area, only to suddenly sense something rushing toward him, prompting him to react instantly as he raised his sword to block an attack bursting from beneath the ground. A creature emerged, revealing itself as an unfamiliar horned mole, and though Lee was momentarily surprised, he cut it down in a single strike through its center, inwardly noting how grotesque it appeared. However, his focus sharpened when he realized that it was not alone, as numerous horned moles began erupting from the ground, swarming toward him with alarming speed and landing several hits that left him injured and struggling to keep up. Gritting his teeth, Lee acknowledged that despite their small size, these creatures were incredibly fast and dangerously sharp, making them a serious threat if he lost concentration even for a moment. As he steadied himself, a thought crossed his mind, hoping that Seong was still alive. Elsewhere, Seong stood bare-chested, breathing heavily as the battlefield around him was littered with injured and fallen cadets, his frustration boiling over as he cursed the relentless swarm. The ground trembled again as more moles charged, but Seong braced himself and fought back fiercely, striking them down one after another with relentless force, almost as if he were playing a game, smashing them aside with determined aggression. Though exhausted, he managed to hold his ground, but just as he tried to catch his breath, another horned mole silently approached from behind and lunged at him. Seong froze in shock, but before the attack could land, Lee appeared behind him, his sword already skewering the creature mid-charge. Startled, Seong turned and questioned Lee's presence, while Lee simply smiled, relieved to see that he had survived. Overcome with emotion, Seong broke down in tears and rushed forward in an attempt to embrace him, only for Lee to quickly stop him and push him away despite trying to remain polite. Even so, Lee felt a quiet sense of relief knowing Seong was safe, but that feeling was quickly overshadowed as his gaze fell upon the lifeless bodies of the cadets nearby, stirring a sense of regret for those he could not save. Seong apologized, explaining that the sudden attack had caught them off guard, and Lee could only acknowledge the situation, understanding that even Seong had been unable to protect everyone. Lee reflected that even if the cadets were nothing more than background figures in the story, they were still living, breathing people, no different from teammates he had fought alongside, and that realization filled him with anger and regret as he clenched his fist tightly. A heavy silence settled between him and Seong before Seong finally broke it, asking what they should do next and whether there was any way to escape, but before Lee could respond, the ground trembled violently once again, catching Seong off guard while Lee remained composed. With a steady gaze, Lee concluded that there was only one option left, and just as he was about to finish his thought, a gigantic horned mole burst out from the ground right in front of them, forcing him to draw his sword and complete his sentence by stating that they needed to defeat the boss monster. Not long after, the battle came to an end, and the surviving cadets found themselves back at the academy under a sky pouring with heavy rain, the somber atmosphere reflecting the gravity of what had happened. The headmaster addressed everyone with deep regret, acknowledging that no amount of compensation could truly ease the grief of those who had lost loved ones, yet promising that they would provide all the support they could to those affected. Amid the downpour, Yunam and Lee walked side by side, and Lee quietly apologized for not being able to save everyone. But Yunam shook his head, explaining that despite regressing countless times, he had never once been able to prevent the dungeon berserk. And as he looked toward the remaining survivors, he pointed out that Lee had accomplished something unprecedented by saving even a portion of the cadets, when, in every other outcome, none would have survived. As the storm passed, the clouds slowly parted and sunlight broke through, casting a warm glow over the academy. And in that quiet moment, Yunam acknowledged that Li's presence had proven to be something even greater than that of a regressor, a statement that caught Li off guard as Yunam offered him a sincere smile. The two shared a brief but meaningful exchange before Yunam handed over his handkerchief, expressing his intention to seek Li's guidance from time to time, and with that, he turned and walked away. Li accepted the gesture and used the cloth to wipe his face, but within his thoughts, he quietly apologized, knowing that the person Yunam would try to rely on from the next day onward would no longer be there, as his time in this place was coming to an end and he would soon return to the tower. Watching Yunam's retreating figure, Li reflected on how Yunam would continue moving forward toward his destined conclusion, just as Li himself had to keep climbing to higher floors and advance toward the end of his own journey. Though the novel's ending might already be set, Li resolved that the conclusion of this tower would be something he would determine himself. And as he heard his teammates calling out to him from behind, he realized that he would not be facing that path alone. With renewed determination, he believed that together, he and his team would shape their own ending, holding on to the hope that it would lead to something brighter. As they moved forward, united by that shared resolve, the system appeared once more, announcing that the mission for the 5th floor had been successfully cleared and that they were being returned to the lobby. Back in the lobby, the atmosphere was filled with relief and celebration as everyone congratulated each other on surviving the ordeal, while he quietly smiled to himself, satisfied with what he had gained, having just acquired level 1 intermediate swordsmanship, something he knew could not even be purchased from the system shop and was far beyond what he had expected as a reward for clearing the 5th floor. Reflecting on it, he realized how much of a difference even a single level in basic swordsmanship had made, leaving him curious about how powerful intermediate swordsmanship would be in comparison.